Tonight we step quietly into a clearing at the edge of a frozen forest where your breath turns instantly to silver in the air, and the logs of your new cabin creak like something alive beneath their crust of frost. The snow under your boots squeaks with that particular dry sound that only comes when temperatures fall far below what feels reasonable. The door in front of you is thick, rough, and slightly warped. Inside there is darkness, a faint scent of old smoke, and the promise of a winter that will test every comfortable assumption you have ever held. You probably will not survive this, at least not in the cozy thermostat-controlled way you are used to. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, tell me where you are in the world and what time it is there right now. I like imagining these stories drifting across time zones. Now dim the lights and push the door inward with your shoulder. The cabin receives you without ceremony. The interior smells of pine sap, old ash, and something faintly sour from last season's stored hides. Light slips through the gaps between the logs in thin glowing lines. A mainstream historical fact is that many remote log cabins in North America during the 18th and 19th centuries were built quickly, often in a matter of days, using freshly cut timber not yet fully seasoned. That means the walls shrink as they dry. That means the cracks widen. That means winter always finds a way in. You set down your small bundle of belongings on a rough-hewn table. The floor is nothing more than packed earth hardened by cold into something almost like stone. When you stamp your boots, the vibration travels up your legs. There is no insulation beneath you, only ground that remembers summer warmth as a distant rumour. The first frost of the season has already claimed the edges of the window opening. There is no glass yet, only oiled paper stretched tight across a simple frame. It glows faintly with afternoon light. Outside the forest stands stiff and silent. Snow clings to branches in heavy patient layers. No birds call, even the wind seems cautious. You run your hand along the inside wall. The logs are uneven, their bark stripped but surfaces still ridged. The chinking between them is a mixture of mud and straw pressed in by hand. It has cracked in places. Cold air slips through in narrow threads, brushing your knuckles like a warning. Historians still argue whether the earliest settlers in especially remote regions truly understood how brutal their first winters would be, or whether optimism and necessity simply outweighed caution. Standing here now, you suspect it was the second. The hearth sits at one end of the cabin, built of fieldstones gathered from the surrounding land. The chimney leans slightly as if already tired. You kneel and brush away last year's ash. The soot leaves black crescents beneath your fingernails. There is something deeply human about this gesture, about kneeling before a cold hearth and deciding that it will burn again. You strike flint to steel. The spark is brief but bright. When the tinder finally catches, the smell of smoke rises sharp and immediate. It curls toward the ceiling, searching for the chimney opening. For a moment it lingers stubbornly inside, and your eyes sting. A quirky tidbit from Frontier Diaries notes that some cabin dwellers deliberately tolerated smoky interiors because the soot helped seal tiny cracks in the roof and walls, adding a crude layer of protection against drafts. You blink through the haze and wonder if that small discomfort might someday feel like security. The fire grows slowly. Each stick you add feels like a small investment. The sound of the first log catching is surprisingly intimate. A soft hiss followed by a gentle crack. Heat radiates outward in uneven waves. Your boots begin to thaw at the edges. Water drips onto the dirt floor and disappears instantly. Outside the sky shifts from pale grey to a deeper blue. The light fades earlier now. Winter is not dramatic in its arrival. It tightens gradually like fingers closing around a wrist. You notice how quickly the temperature inside drops if you move too far from the hearth. The cabin is not one uniform climate. It is a map of cold and less cold. Near the fire, your cheeks warm. 3 steps away, your breath is visible again. You sit on a low stool and listen. The silence is not empty. It is layered. The faint pop of sap inside burning wood. the distant thud of snow slipping from a branch, the small shifting sound of the cabin itself as the timber contracts in the deepening chill. Wood behaves differently in extreme cold. It tightens, complains, releases tension in tiny snaps. At first, each sound feels like a threat. Then you begin to understand its rhythm. There is no clock on the wall. Time here is measured by light and by the hunger that eventually rises in your stomach. You unpack a small sack of dried beans and a strip of salted pork. The meal is simple, repetitive, and entirely sufficient. You chew slowly, aware that every calorie matters now. Winter in a remote log cabin is not about abundance. It is about careful balance. As darkness settles fully, the cabin transforms. The fire becomes the only source of illumination. Shadows climb the walls in wavering shapes. Your own silhouette stretches tall and distorted behind you. It is easy to imagine stories in those shapes. In isolated communities, long winters often encouraged rich traditions of storytelling. Scholars continue to debate whether the intensity of winter isolation does directly shape certain regional folk tales, or whether those tales simply found a more attentive audience during the cold months. Sitting here alone with the hiss of burning wood, you feel how stories might grow naturally from this kind of quiet. You test the door latch once more before night. The iron feels painfully cold against your fingers. Outside, the temperature is dropping fast. The first frost has already glazed the clearing. By morning, the world will look sharper edges defined in white. You spread a thin mattress stuffed with straw near the hearth. It is not comfortable by modern standards, but proximity to heat matters more than softness. You remove your outer coat, but keep your wool layers on. In cabins like this, sleeping fully clothed during winter was common practice. Warmth is not something you waste on modesty. As you lie down, you become acutely aware of the cabin's smallness. The ceiling beams are low, the walls close in gently, yet there is also a sense of shelter. The logs, imperfect and gapped still, stand between you and the frozen forest. That is no small thing. The fire settles into a steady glow. Outside, the night deepens without apology. You listen to your own breathing, to the occasional shifting of timber, to the faint whisper of wind probing at the cracks. Winter has arrived. Not dramatically, not with a single catastrophic storm, but with a steady, undeniable presence. You close your eyes and feel the uneven warmth on your face, the chill lingering at your back, the earth beneath you firm and ancient. This is your beginning. A remote log cabin, a frozen season stretching ahead, and the quiet realization that survival here will not depend on heroics, but on small, patient acts repeated day after day. The frost outside thickens as you drift towards sleep, and somewhere in the forest something moves through the snow unseen and unconcerned with your small firelight. Morning does not burst into the cabin. It seeps in, slowly pale and reluctant, filtering through the oiled paper window in a muted wash of grey. You wake before you are fully ready, not because of noise, but because the fire has dwindled to a faint red pulse, and the cold has crept closer during the night. The air feels sharper now, your nose tingles, the tip of your ear stings where it slipped free of your blanket. For a moment you remain still and listen. The silence of deep winter has a density to it. No dripping water, no rustling leaves, only a faint distant crack from the forest as some tree adjusts to the temperature drop. You sit up slowly, careful not to let too much warmth escape from beneath your quilt. Even that simple motion changes the balance of heat around you. The hearth demands attention immediately. You kneel, stir the embers, and coax them back to life with dry kindling prepared the day before. This is your first lesson of the morning. Warmth is not a background condition, it is a task. A well-known historical reality is that maintaining a continuous fire through winter nights was considered essential in many isolated cabins, and families often banked the hearth carefully before sleep to preserve precious coals until dawn. When the embers survive, you feel as though you have won a small victory. The flames rise again, and with them comes the scent of pine resin and old ash. Smoke curls upward, finding its path more easily now that the chimney has warmed. You hold your hands near the fire, palms open, feeling sensation return to your fingers and tiny pricks. The discomfort is brief but memorable. Once the cabin begins to warm, you turn your attention to the walls. Yesterday you noticed hairline cracks in the chinking. Overnight the freeze has widened them slightly. Thin threads of daylight show through in places you swear were sealed. You run your thumb along the mud and straw mixture, feeling where it has pulled away from the logs. It is brittle now, less forgiving. Sealing cracks against the cold becomes your morning occupation. You gather a small bucket of damp clay kept inside precisely so it does not freeze solid. You press it into the gaps with slow, deliberate movements. The texture is gritty and cold against your skin. Each handful makes a faint squelching sound as it settles into place. This repetitive motion is oddly calming. There is an almost meditative quality to patching a cabin wall. You move log by log, gap by gap. You lean in close, examining each seam as though you were reading a quiet story written in timber grain. The cabin teaches you where it is weakest. You begin to understand its personality. Historians continue to debate whether settlers preferred clay-based chinking or moss packed tightly between logs in harsher climates. Some argue that moss offered better flexibility as wood expanded and contracted, while others maintain that clay mixtures provided more immediate insulation despite cracking over time. As you work, you imagine those debates unfolding in warm academic rooms far removed from this biting air. Out here, theory is less persuasive than whether your fingers go numb. A quirky note from certain frontier journals mentions that some families stuffed scraps of old cloth into persistent gaps, layering fabric beneath fresh clay to trap more air. You find a worn strip from a torn shirt and press it deep into one stubborn crack before sealing it over. It feels like giving the wall a quiet bandage. The process takes hours. Outside, the light grows brighter but not warmer. Snow reflects the sun in a glare that makes your eyes water if you stare too long. The clearing beyond the cabin looks deceptively peaceful. It is easy to forget that the temperature remains far below freezing. Inside, the difference is subtle but meaningful. Each sealed gap reduces the faint whisper of draft. The air no longer brushes your ankles quite so sharply. You notice how much of winter survival depends on noticing small changes. A slightly warmer corner, a slightly quieter wall. Your stomach reminds you that patching walls does not count as breakfast. You set a pot near the hearth and melt a small scoop of snow collected the day before. Snow alone is inefficient for water. It takes surprising volume to yield even a modest amount. Still, it supplements your supply. You drop in a handful of oats and stir with a wooden spoon. The smell is simple and comforting. As the porridge thickens, you sit back on your stool and observe the cabin. In this clearer daylight, the logs glow softly in the firelight. Their surfaces are uneven tool marks visible where axes shaped them months ago. A remote log cabin is never perfectly symmetrical. Each log carries its own curve, its own knots and scars. That irregularity creates beauty, though it is not the polished beauty of modern design. It is practical, honest. You eat slowly, aware that each mouthful carries warmth into your core. Outside, the forest remains still. No neighbour's chimney smoke rises in the distance. Isolation is not dramatic here. It is simply the absence of interruption. After breakfast, you step outside briefly to test the air. The cold grips your face, instantly biting at any exposed skin. Your boots sink into a thin crust of snow. The skies are hard blue, almost metallic. You circle the cabin, examining the exterior seams. From this angle, you see where frost has formed along the edges of the logs. The moisture inside has met the freezing air, leaving delicate patterns that look almost decorative. You place additional mud into exterior gaps where you can reach. The work is slower with gloves on, but removing them would invite frostbite. You feel the contrast between your warm breath inside the scarf and the unyielding cold beyond it. When you return inside and close the door, the difference feels profound. The cabin may be imperfect, but it is a barrier. It is the line between manageable discomfort and genuine danger. By afternoon, the patched walls hold steady. The drafts are softer now, less insistent. The fire burns with a more confident glow. You sit again, hands resting on your knees, and allow yourself a small exhale of satisfaction. Sealing cracks against the cold does not make winter disappear. It does not silence the forest or shorten the nights, but it shifts the balance slightly in your favour. In a season defined by endurance, slight advantages matter. As the sun begins its early descent, the cabin feels marginally more secure than it did at dawn. You know new cracks will appear as temperatures fluctuate. You know the process will repeat. But today you have learned the texture of these walls. You have pressed your effort directly into their seams. The light fades once more, and the hearth resumes its role as the cabin's quiet centre. You sit close watching flames lick at the logs, aware that tomorrow will bring its own small tasks. Winter is not conquered in one dramatic act. It is negotiated patiently, one gap at a time. The hearth becomes your sun without asking permission. By the third morning, you no longer think of the fire as something you light. You think of it as something you tend the way one might tend a small animal that depends entirely on your attention. When you wake, your first glance is not toward the window, but toward the stone mouth at the end of the cabin. Is it glowing? Is it breathing? You rise before the cold fully claims the room. The embers are still alive, a low red shimmer beneath grey ash. You crouch and blow gently. The ash lifts in a soft cloud, revealing brighter coals beneath. The smell is dry and mineral tinged with last night's pine. A mainstream historical fact is that in remote cabins the hearth truly functioned as the centre of domestic life, not just for cooking and heat, but for light laundry, tool repair, and even informal schooling. Everything arranged itself around firelight. You feed the embers small sticks first, then thicker pieces. There is a rhythm to it. Too much wood at once smothers the flame. Too little, and it fades into stubborn smoke. You learn quickly that fire is not impressed by impatience. As flames rise, warmth spreads outward in the visible gradients. The air closest to the hearth feels almost gentle. A few steps back, it is brisk. At the door, frost still rims the edges of the frame. The cabin becomes a map of temperatures, and you position yourself accordingly. Stool near the hearth, bed angled to catch maximum heat. Water bucket set close enough to prevent freezing, but not so close that it boils. You hold your hands toward the blaze and watch how light reshapes the room. The rough logs glow amber. Shadows stretch behind tools hanging on wooden pegs. The kettle's curved surface reflects a small dancing sun. It is astonishing how quickly your mood ties itself to this flicker. Without it, the cabin feels inert. With it, everything hums faintly with purpose. There is a reason the hearth was often considered symbolic of the home itself. In some early European traditions, carried across the Atlantic, embers from an old hearth were used to light a new one when families relocated, as if transferring continuity through flame. A quirky detail recorded in certain Appalachian communities describes families preserving a single coal wrapped in bark during short moves, believing it carried good fortune if the fire never fully died. You find yourself strangely protective of your coals. You set a cast iron pot over the fire to warm water. Iron absorbs heat slowly but holds it well. As the metal warms, it emits a faint metallic scent mixed with soot. You listen to the subtle tick of expansion as it adjusts to temperature. The cabin answers in kind. Logs pop softly as sap pockets react to heat. The soundscape is intimate. Fire does not roar here. It murmurs. It hisses when a knot releases moisture. It snaps when a log splits. Each noise carries information. Too much hissing might mean damp wood. Too many sharp cracks could signal rapid burning and wasted fuel. You begin to read these cues almost unconsciously. Historians still argue whether early cabin dwellers overestimated the amount of firewood required for winter or consistently underestimated it. Accounts vary wildly. Some diaries mention towering stacks prepared months in advance. Others describe frantic midwinter cutting when supplies dwindled. You glance toward your modest woodpile outside and silently hope you fall into the first category. Midday light arrives pale and thin, but the hearth's glow remains dominant. You kneel to rake ash carefully to one side, creating a hotter zone for cooking and a gentler area for slow simmering. This small choreography feels almost ceremonial. The hearth dictates your movements. You do not rush across the room unnecessarily, because every step away from heat carries a cost. You eat your meal close to the fire. Steam rises from your bowl and mingles with smoke drifting upward. The air grows hazy but tolerable. Over time, the ceiling beams darken from soot. Your lungs adjust, though perhaps not perfectly. The smell of smoke settles into your clothes, your hair, even your blankets. It becomes part of you. By afternoon, you bring a small stool closer and mend a tear in your wool sleeve. The firelight illuminates the needle as it dips in and out of fabric. You angle yourself so that your shadow does not swallow the work. This too is how the hearth shapes your day. Tasks cluster around it, orbiting like planets around a small sun. When the wind picks up outside, you hear it brush along the cabin walls. The sound is hollow and low, but the interior remains relatively stable. The fire holds steady. Its presence becomes reassurance. There is comfort in watching something burn predictably in a season that feels otherwise uncertain. You notice how the heat creates subtle zones of smell. Close to the hearth there is resin and char. Near the door, faint, cold air carries the scent of snow, clean and sharp. In the middle of the room, the two mingle in a curious balance. As evening approaches, you prepare for the long stretch of darkness. You stack additional logs within arm's reach. You shift larger pieces to the back of the hearth where they will catch slowly and burn through the night. Banking a fire properly is a skill often learned through experience rather than instruction. Too much fuel and you risk overheating or sparks. Too little and you do frost creeping across the inside wall. Scholars continue to debate how much fuel an average family consumed in a single winter in especially remote regions. Estimates differ based on climate and cabin size, but no one disputes that wood cutting was relentless labour long before snow ever fell. Sitting here now, you feel the weight of each log differently. It's not just wood. It is stored time, stored effort, stored future warmth. Night settles outside without spectacle. The window darkens to a faint mirror. You see your own reflection in the oiled paper flickering behind flame. The forest beyond disappears completely. The hearth becomes the only source of certainty. You sit close enough to feel heat on your shins. Your hands rest loosely in your lap. The cabin walls glow softly, their imperfections gentled by firelight. You realize that the hearth is not merely functional, it is emotional architecture. It anchors you. It organizes your thoughts. Without it, the cabin would feel like a wooden box in a frozen clearing. With it, the space feels inhabited, almost companionable. You add one final log before preparing for sleep. The flames rise, then settle into a steady rhythm. You arrange your bedding once more near the warmest zone. As you lie down, the firelight flickers across the ceiling beams in slow waves. Shadows move like quiet breathing. The hearth hums softly, a low, steady presence in the darkness. It is not dramatic. It does not blaze like a bonfire. It simply persists. And in a winter that promises months of cold and silence, persistence is everything. Sleep inside the cabin is never a complete surrender. It is more like a negotiation conducted in layers of wool and flickering light. You wake in the deep hours of night, not because of a loud sound, but because the warmth has shifted. The fire has settled into a low orange cradle, steady but less ambitious than before. The air at the edges of the room feels sharper. Your nose is cold. Your breath leaves a faint cloud that catches the remaining glow. You lie still for a moment listening. The timber gives a soft, restrained pop as it contracts. Somewhere outside, snow slips from a branch with a muted thud. These noises no longer jolt you upright. They pass through your awareness gently. The cabin is learning to speak, and you are learning its vocabulary. Sleeping arrangements in remote winter cabins were rarely luxurious. It is well documented that many families shared beds during the coldest months, both to conserve heat and to reduce the amount of bedding required. Even those living alone often positioned their straw mattresses as close to the hearth as safety allowed. You understand the logic intimately now. The bed is not placed for aesthetic symmetry. It is angled carefully toward warmth like a plant leaning towards sun. You adjust your quilt, pulling it tighter around your shoulders. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and wool oil. Beneath you, the straw mattress rustles softly as you shift. It is uneven in places, thinner near the edges where straw has compacted. You smooth it with your hand, a small ritual that feels oddly reassuring. There is a curious comfort in heavy quilts. Their weight presses you gently into stillness. You feel cocooned, though not entirely insulated. Cold still lingers at the margins, brushing your toes, grazing your cheek if you turn too far from the fire. It keeps you aware. You sit up and add a single log to the hearth, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of coals. Sparks leap briefly bright as tiny stars before fading into ash. The added wood catches slowly and warmth deepens once more. People in isolated cabins often slept partially clothed through winter nights. Linen shirts, wool stockings, even outer layers sometimes remained in place, their modesty bowed to practicality. You consider removing your boots, but decide against it. The leather holds a bit of residual heat, and if you need to rise quickly, fumbling in the coal would cost precious minutes. A curious detail preserved in some rural letters from the 19th century mentions the practice of warming stones in the hearth and wrapping them in cloth to place at the foot of the bed. These improvised bed warmers radiated steady heat for hours. You glance at the stones lining your hearth and make a mental note to try this tomorrow evening. Even a modest interest in warmth can change the entire texture of sleep. You lie back down and allow your thoughts to drift. The firelight flickers against your eyelids in soft pulses. Shadows move gently across the ceiling beams. The room feels smaller at night, more intimate. Without daylight to stretch the space outward, everything gathers closer around the hearth. There has long been discussion among researchers about how prolonged winter confinement influenced emotional resilience in remote households. Some propose that tight living quarters strengthened family bonds, while others suggest that tension simmered beneath polite routines. Alone here, you feel a blend of both possibilities. Solitude sharpens self-awareness. Every creak, every breath, every small discomfort becomes noticeable. Yet there is also a quiet pride in managing it without complaint. You turn onto your side and listen again. The wind brushes faintly against the outer wall. It does not howl tonight, it merely tests the seams sliding along the logs in a low whisper. You're aware of how thin the barrier truly is. A few inches of timber separate you from a landscape that would freeze unprotected skin in minutes. Your fingers trace the edge of the quilt absent-mindedly. The stitching is uneven in places, evidence of hurried mending by firelight. Imperfections no longer bother you. They feel like signatures of effort. Gradually your breathing slows. The fire settles into a steady rhythm, neither roaring nor fading. It is a quiet companion. The warmth reaches just far enough to make sleep possible, though never indulgent. You think briefly of modern bedrooms, sealed windows, and central heating that hums invisibly through walls. Here heat is visible, audible, scented. You cannot ignore it. You must engage with it. Perhaps that constant awareness makes rest feel more deliberate. As you drift towards sleep again, you notice how the cabin's interior has taken on a particular fragrance. Smoke, wool, faint damp earth from the floor and the resin of pine logs blend into something uniquely its own. It is not unpleasant. It is grounding. Hours pass without your tracking them. At some point the fire dims once more, but not enough to threaten. You remain half aware, half dreaming, attuned to subtle changes in temperature. Just before dawn, the coal presses slightly closer again. You sense it at your fingertips where the quilt has slipped. You pull it back into place without fully waking. This dance between heat and chill continues through the night, gentle but persistent. When the first grey hint of morning filters through the oiled paper window, you open your eyes slowly. Frost feathers the inner edges of the frame. The hearth glows faintly, having survived until light. You sit up, feeling the stiffness in your shoulders, the lingering coolness at your back. It is not misery, it is simply the cost of winter. You rise carefully, wrap the quilt around your shoulders and kneel once more at the hearth. Another day waits beyond the door, another stretch of snow and silence, but for now the small circle of warmth around the fire is enough. The night has passed without drama. The cabin still stands, the logs still hold, and you, bundled in heavy quilts and thin resolve, have slept through another frozen darkness. By mid-morning you discover that water has its own opinions about winter. The bucket you left near the hearth is safe, its surface only faintly crusted with a fragile skim of ice. But the second pail, positioned a little too far from the fire in an effort to save space, has frozen nearly solid. You tap the rim with your knuckles and hear a dull, heavy sound. The surface is white and opaque, thick enough to resist casual effort. Water, which in warmer months seems abundant and almost careless, becomes deliberate now. Every drop requires planning. It is widely recorded that in remote winter cabins, families often stored water indoors overnight precisely to prevent freezing. Yet even then, it could form ice, depending on proximity to the hearth. You run your hand along the frozen surface and feel the stubbornness of it. You set the frozen pail close to the fire and wait. Thawing takes patience. If you place it too near the flames, the outer layer melts rapidly while the core remains solid, creating uneven stress in the container. You have no desire to crack a bucket when replacement is not an option. While the ice softens slowly, you wrap yourself in your thick coat and prepare to fetch more snow from outside. Opening the door releases a brief rush of colder air that feels almost shocking against your face. The clearing is brighter today. Sunlight glances off the snow in sharp flashes that make you squint. The forest stands rigid, branches coated in white. You step carefully across the crusted surface, listening to the crunch beneath your boots. Snow squeaks at this temperature, a high dry sound that seems almost too delicate for such harsh conditions. You fill a sack with clean snow from an untouched patch, avoiding areas near the cabin where ash or debris might have settled. It is a simple act, scooping snow into a sack, yet it reminds you how deceptive winter landscapes can be. Snow looks plentiful and even, but it yields surprisingly little water when melted. You carry the sack back inside and shake loose clumps into a pot near the hearth. Melting snow produces a faint earthy scent, subtle but noticeable. As it collapses into liquid, the volume reduces dramatically. You add more snow, watching it sink and shrink. This is how mornings pass here, in small cycles of collection and transformation. A lesser-known but charming detail found in some frontier recollections mentions that children were often tasked with bringing in snow for melting, turning it into a kind of winter chore that felt almost playful at first. Adults knew the labour was necessary. Children sometimes saw it as an excuse to dash through drifts and return with cheeks flushed bright red. Alone here, you miss that energy for a moment. The first bucket finally loosens enough to chip gently with a wooden spoon. You break apart thick pieces and slide them into a pot to accelerate melting. Ice clinks softly against iron. The sound echoes faintly in the small cabin. Debate persists among historians about whether most remote settlers relied more heavily on nearby streams cutting through ice daily or on snow collection during the deepest freezes. Geography played a significant role. In regions where rivers remained accessible, hauling water directly was often preferred despite the danger of thin ice. In more isolated forest clearings like yours, snow was frequently the safer if slower option. You test the thawed water with your finger. It is painfully cold. You warm a small portion for washing, pouring it into a basin and holding your hands above it for a moment before dipping them in. The sensation is sharp at first, then strangely invigorating. Washing in winter is not about indulgence. It is about maintenance. You splash your face lightly, aware that any lingering moisture must be dried quickly to prevent chill. The towel smells faintly of smoke. By midday, you have managed to refill both buckets. They sit close to the hearth, now guarded carefully. You notice how their placement has become strategic. Too close and they steam excessively. Too far and they begin to glaze over again. The cabin floor around them grows damp in small patches where splashes have fallen. The earth absorbs it slowly. You sip a cup of warmed water and feel it spread through your chest. Hydration in winter can be deceptive. Cold dulls thirst, yet the dry air and constant exposure to smoke draw moisture from you quietly. Outside, faint breeze stirs loose powder from treetops. It drifts downward in glittering veils. You watch through the window where every gust reshapes the surface of the clearing. Paths you stamped yesterday have softened at the edges. Tracks blur. Winter erases evidence gently but thoroughly. Inside, the cabin holds steady warmth. The water buckets gleam faintly in the firelight. You feel a small satisfaction in seeing them full. Each bucket represents foresight. You begin to understand how daily life here becomes a series of preventative gestures. Banking coals before bed, patching cracks before storms, melting snow before thirst insists. Nothing is left to last-minute convenience. There is something humbling in hauling and thawing water. It forces you to notice the physical reality behind every cup you drink. You measure carefully when adding it to stew or porridge. You think twice before spilling even a few drops. As the afternoon light tilts lower, you glance once more at the buckets. A thin mist rises from their surfaces in the warmer air near the hearth. They look almost content, transformed from stubborn blocks of ice into usable resource. You settle back onto your stool and extend your hands toward the fire. The rhythm of winter continues. Water freezes. You thaw it. Snow falls. You collect it. These cycles repeat with quiet insistence. Beyond the cabin walls, the forest remains indifferent. It does not hurry to help. It does not apologize for the cold. Yet within these rough logs you carve out small pockets of control, a steady flame, a sealed crack, a bucket of water that will not freeze tonight. Such modest victories accumulate, and in a frozen season, where comfort is measured in degrees and inches, that accumulation becomes the difference between mere endurance and something approaching stability. By late afternoon, your thoughts turn to food, and more specifically to wood. Hunger is straightforward. It rises slowly, settles in your stomach, and reminds you of itself with polite persistence. Fuel is more complicated. Every meal requires calculation. Every pot placed over the hearth consumes not just ingredients, but future warmth. You step outside briefly to inspect your woodpile. The logs are stacked carefully along the cabin wall, raised slightly off the ground on split rails to keep them dry. A widely accepted historical reality is that families in remote cabins often spent the late summer and autumn cutting and stacking several cords of firewood in preparation for winter. Knowing that once deep snow arrived, fresh cutting became slower and more dangerous. You run your hand along the top of the stack and feel the brittle dryness of seasoned timber. Inside, you kneel before the hearth and study the current burn. The flames are lively but not excessive. You rake coals to one side, creating a hotter zone for cooking and a cooler edge for simmering. The choreography feels almost instinctive now. Cooking when wood is scarce is less about culinary ambition and more about efficiency. You measure dried beans into a pot, add a small strip of salted meat and pour in water that you thawed earlier. The ingredients are humble, but their simplicity carries reassurance. As the pot settles over, the heat steam rises in slow spirals. The smell of salt and starch mingles with smoke. You sit close, stirring occasionally, aware that even stirring costs warmth as your body shifts away from the fire. There are recorded accounts from frontier households describing the practice of cooking multiple dishes at once to maximize a single period of high heat, then letting them cool gradually near the hearth. In this way, one burst of fuel served several meals. You consider preparing extra beans now to reheat tomorrow, reducing the need for additional wood later. The challenge is balance. If you let the fire burn too hot, you consume logs faster than planned. If you keep it too low, food takes longer and may not cook thoroughly. You study the flames carefully, adjusting with small additions rather than dramatic changes. A curious and lesser-known detail appears in some early rural cookbooks that mention baking bread directly in covered iron pots buried in coals, creating a compact oven effect without requiring a large built-in structure. The method conserved heat and shielded loaves from smoke. You glance at your simple pot and imagine trying this technique when flour supplies allow. Outside, twilight begins to gather early. The window dims gradually and the forest edges blur into shadow. You hear a faint scrape of wind against the wall, nothing urgent, just a reminder of the temperature beyond. Inside the stew thickens slowly. Bubbles rise at a steady pace, releasing bursts of aroma that feel almost luxurious in their warmth. You inhale deeply and notice how food scent changes your perception of the space. The cabin feels less like a shelter and more like a kitchen, a place of deliberate care. There has been ongoing discussion among scholars about how winter diets in isolated cabins influence long-term health. Some argue that reliance on preserved meats and dried legumes provided adequate calories but limited fresh nutrients. Others suggest that creative use of stored root vegetables and foraged dried herbs offset deficiencies more than previously assumed. As you stir your pot, you sense the truth lies somewhere between necessity and ingenuity. You ladle a small portion into a wooden bowl and taste carefully. The salt is pronounced but welcome. The beans are soft, yielding easily under your spoon. Heat travels through your chest and spreads outward, countering the chill that lingers near the door. You eat slowly, aware that every mouthful required both wood and time. There is no idle snacking here. Meals are events measured by flame and patience. When you finish, you leave the remaining stew close to the hearth but not directly over flame. It will stay warm for a while without demanding additional fuel. You reduce the fire slightly, allowing it to settle into a steady glow rather than a hungry blaze. The wood pile outside remains a steel and ledger. Each log burned today reduces the future stack by 1. You find yourself counting, subconsciously estimating how many weeks of cold remain. The arithmetic is imperfect, but the awareness persists. You gather small fallen twigs from a basket near the door, and add just enough to maintain warmth without excess. This restraint feels mature somehow, a quiet acknowledgement that winter is a marathon rather than a sprint. As darkness fully claims the clearing, the hearth's glow takes over once again. The cabin walls reflect amber light. Shadows move gently as flames shift. You sit with your back to the logs and let your stomach settle. Cooking, when wood is scarce, teaches you attentiveness. It encourages foresight. It discourages waste. You cannot turn a knob to increase heat. You cannot ignore the cost of boiling water for too long. Outside, the temperature drops further. You sense it not through sight but through the way the air near the door feels sharper when you approach. The window gathers a faint frosting at its edges. You rise to secure the latch and then return to the hearth, adding one final modest piece of wood to carry warmth into the evening. The stew pot rests quietly nearby, still radiating gentle heat. The cabin smells of smoke and beans and faint resin from burning pine. In a world where convenience has not yet been invented, this modest meal feels complete. You have balanced hunger against fuel appetite, against foresight. And as you sit in the glow of carefully rationed firelight, you understand that winter survival is not defined by grand heroics, but by these measured decisions repeated daily, flame by flame, bowl by bowl. The path to the world beyond your clearing disappears overnight. You open the door one morning and find that the familiar narrow track leading toward the forest edge has vanished beneath a smooth, undisturbed blanket of snow. There is no visible indentation, no hint that boots passed that way just yesterday. The landscape looks newly invented, as though you are the first person ever to stand here. Snow has a way of softening boundaries. Fence posts become rounded shapes. Fallen logs transform into gentle mounds. The clearing itself seems smaller, enclosed by drifts that lean subtly toward the cabin walls. You step out cautiously, the cold biting at your cheeks, and sink mid-calf into powder that was not there before. The sensation is both muffled and firm. Sound behaves differently too. The usual crunch is dulled. Even your own movements feel absorbed. It's well established in frontier accounts that heavy snowfall could isolate remote cabins for days or even weeks, especially when access roads were little more than narrow trails. In such conditions, travel became risky, sometimes impossible, until winds shifted or sun softened the drifts. Standing here now, you feel that truth settle into your chest. You look toward where a distant neighbour's chimney might be visible on clear days. Today there is nothing but white and a pale sky, no smoke plume, no moving figure, just a horizon blurred by snowfall. Returning inside, you close the door firmly and lean against it for a moment. The cabin seems quieter than usual, as if it too senses the altered world outside. Snow does not merely cover paths, it dampens sound. The forest beyond your walls feels suspended. You add a log to the hearth and watch sparks rise briefly before fading. The glow steadies the room. Inside, the air remains manageable, outside the drifts accumulate without urgent. There are letters and journal entries from isolated settlers describing this particular kind of silence, a silence so complete that it felt almost physical. Some writers compared it to being wrapped in thick cloth. Others described it as comforting a pause from the unpredictability of wind and storm. You sit and consider which description fits you better. As midday light filters through the window, you realize that time itself feels altered. Without visitors, without visible tracks, without any distant sound of human activity, the day stretches in an unusual way. Hours seem longer, yet oddly indistinct. There has been considerable discussion among researchers about how prolonged winter isolation affected mental well-being in frontier environments. Some suggest that solitude fostered resilience and deep self-reliance. Others note that cabin fever was not merely a metaphor, but a documented emotional strain. Alone in your small wooden space, you sense how both perspectives might coexist. You move through routine tasks deliberately. Sweep a small patch of floor, rearrange stacked kindling, check the water buckets. Each action anchors you in the present. The rhythm of maintenance keeps the mind from wandering too far into unhelpful territory. A charming but unusual anecdote appears in certain rural memoirs recounting how children would sometimes create imaginary roads across snow-covered floors inside the cabin during extended storms, tracing patterns with fingers in soot near the hearth. It was a small rebellion against confinement, a way to invent movement when none was possible outside. You smile faintly at the thought, imagining tiny hands carving pretend pathways in ash. The afternoon light dims earlier than you expect. Thick clouds gather, blending seamlessly with the white ground. For a moment you cannot distinguish sky from earth through the window. It is all one continuous shade. You step outside again briefly to assess the drift against the door. Snow has begun to pile along the lower edge. You push it aside with your boot, creating a narrow channel to ensure the door can still open freely tomorrow. This small preventative act feels essential. Back inside the hearth resumes its steady glow. The cabin interior becomes your entire world for the moment. The walls no longer feel like boundaries so much as companions. They contain your breath, your warmth, your quiet persistence. Isolation does not announce itself dramatically. It settles gradually. You become more aware of your own thoughts, more attentive to subtle sounds. The pop of a burning knot seems louder. The scrape of a stool across the floor feels more pronounced. You sit close to the fire and let your gaze rest on the flames. They move in patient waves, consuming wood with methodical certainty. Outside, snow continues to fall, though you cannot hear it clearly through the thickened silence. There is something almost sacred about being snowed in. The world beyond your clearing is temporarily irrelevant. No errands, no visitors, no obligations beyond survival and care. It is both heavy and freeing. You think about the unseen road that lies beneath the drifts. It has not disappeared entirely. It is merely hidden. Beneath the smooth surface, the path still exists, waiting for thaw or shovel. As evening descends, the window reflects only your own fire-lit interior. The forest has withdrawn into darkness. You secure the latch once more, check the position of your woodpile through the small gap near the door, and return to your stool. The cabin hums softly with contained warmth. Snowed in and cut off, you begin to understand that isolation is not simply the absence of company. It is the amplification of everything else. The creak of wood, the rhythm of breath, the steady pulse of flame. Winter has drawn a circle around your cabin. for now that circle holds. Your clothes stop being fashion and become architecture. You notice it first when you step away from the hearth to fetch something from the far corner of the cabin. The air there is several degrees colder, and it bites instantly through thinner layers. Your skin reacts before your mind does. A shiver climbs your spine like an automatic message. You return to the fire and begin adding pieces to your outfit the way you might add logs to a wall. In-winter clothing is not decoration. It is portable shelter. The difference between comfort and danger can be the thickness of a sleeve, the tightness of a cuff, the presence of a scarf wrapped just right. One widely recognized historical point is that wool was prized in many cold weather frontier environments because it retains insulating value. Even when damp, unlike cotton, which can chill the body when wet. Linen appears too especially as base layers, but wool is the workhorse. You look down at your own garments and feel grateful for every scratchy thread. The cabin is dim in the morning light, so you sit close to the fire to dress properly. You pull on wool stockings first. They are slightly uneven from previous mending. The fabric grips your calves with gentle pressure. Next comes a linen shirt that feels cool to the touch at first, then warms as it traps your body heat. Over that a wool tunic thicker and heavier. Finally your outer coat stiff with smoke smell and winter air. The act of dressing takes longer than it would in a modern home. There is no warm closet, no preheated fabric. Each garment begins cold and must be convinced to cooperate. You pause now and then, holding sleeves near the fire before pushing your arms through. Mending becomes an everyday necessity. You discover that wear happens faster here. Cuffs fray from constant movement. Knees thin from kneeling at the hearth and on packed earth. Gloves split at the fingertips from hauling wood. The cold itself seems to stress fabric. A curious, almost charming detail from rural accounts mentions that some cabin dwellers kept a dedicated mending basket near the hearth so repairs could be done whenever firelight was available. The basket often contained scraps of cloth saved from older garments because nothing was wasted. You glance at your own small pile of saved fabric and realize you have started doing the same without thinking. You sit and patch a tear along your sleeve seam. The needle feels small in your fingers, and your fingertips are slightly numb despite the heat nearby. Thread catches on rough wool fibers. You take slow stitches, careful not to snap the thread. Each pull feels like it tightens more than fabric. It tightens your relationship to this season. There is ongoing academic disagreement about how much clothing the average frontier household truly owned. Some argue that garments were few but heavily used and frequently repaired. Others point to probate inventories suggesting more items than we often imagine, though not necessarily in good condition. Here in your small cabin, the answer feels personal. You own what you can maintain. You stand and test the repaired sleeve. It holds. The satisfaction is quiet but real. Outside, the wind has risen again. You open the door a crack and a blade of cold air slides in. It carries the smell of snow, clean and sharp, mixed with pine, and something faintly animal from the forest. You close the door quickly and pull your scarf higher. Even inside, drafts travel across the floor in thin streams. You begin to appreciate small clothing choices, a hat that covers ears properly, a scarf that can be tightened or loosened depending on activity, a belt that keeps layers from shifting. Even the way you tuck shirt tails matters, sealing warmth in rather than letting it leak out. Some lesser-told frontier notes describe stuffing extra cloth or even dried grass inside boots for insulation when proper footwear was lacking. It is a clever, desperate trick. You check your own boots and feel relief that they are sturdy, though the leather is cracked in places. Still, you find yourself adding a folded scrap of wool near the toe for extra warmth just in case. Midday tasks pull you away from the hearth. You must bring in water, check the woodpile clear snow from the doorway. Each time you step outside, your clothing meets the cold like armor. You feel the wind press against your coat, searching for weak seams. You feel snow brush against your leggings. Your breath collects in your scarf and dampens it slightly. And here the usefulness of wool becomes clear. The scarf grows a bit wet from breath, yet it still holds warmth. It does not become an icy collar immediately, though it will if left too long. You rotate it, warming one side by the fire, later letting moisture evaporate slowly. Back inside, you hang outer layers near the hearth, but not too close. Too close and they risk scorching. Too far and they remain damp and cold. There is a science to drying in a cabin learned by error and patience. The cabin smells of damp wool for a while, mingling with smoke. It's not unpleasant. It is simply the scent of winter work. As evening comes, you sit again with the needle and thread. Clothing maintenance becomes part of your nightly rhythm, like banking the fire or checking the latch. You reinforce a glove seam. You darn a sock. You fold repaired items carefully and place them within reach for morning. There is something almost soothing about this repetition. Stitch, pull, tighten. The work is small enough to focus the mind without demanding too much energy. Researchers still debate whether constant winter mending fostered a kind of domestic creativity, with women and men improvising repairs and adaptations that would later influence regional textile traditions. Sitting here, you can believe it. When necessity rules invention follows quietly. Night deepens. The cabin's interior becomes a pool of warmth and shadow. You remove your outer coat but keep most layers on. You place tomorrow's clothing close to the hearth so it will be less bitter in the morning. Then you lie down and feel the weight of wool pressing gently against you, holding pockets of warmth in place. Your clothes, stiff and imperfect, have done their job. They have carried you through drafts and wind, through a brief fight with snow at the door, through the shifting temperatures of the cabin. In a frozen winter, the cabin shelters you from the worst. But your clothing shelters you from what still leaks in. It becomes the second wall, the personal cabin you wear. And as you drift towards sleep, you realize you no longer think of layers as optional. They are part of your body now, as necessary as breath, as normal as firelight. The animals feel winter differently, but no less urgently. Before the sun has fully lifted above the trees, you are already pulling on boots and wrapping your scarf tight. The fire is stable for the moment, banked carefully. The cabin will hold its warmth for a short while without you. Outside, the cold greets you without hesitation. It presses against your coat, seeps through fabric seams, nips at the edge of your scarf. The barn stands a short distance from the cabin, its roof bowed slightly under the weight of snow. Each step toward it is deliberate. Snow reaches higher along your shins today, and the air feels thinner, sharper. Your breath forms dense clouds that trail behind you. Caring for livestock during frozen months was not optional in remote settings. Surviving animals often meant surviving people. It is commonly noted in agricultural records from early frontier regions that families prioritized feed storage and shelter repairs before winter, knowing that weakened animals could not easily be replaced. You feel the truth of that in your bones as you push open the barn door. Inside, the air smells of hay, damp wood and animal warmth. It is noticeably less bitter than outside, though far from comfortable. A cow shifts her weight and exhales a slow plume of steam. Chickens rustle softly and their corner feathers puffed. Their movement sounds small but alive. You move first to check the water trough. A thin sheet of ice has formed overnight. You break it gently with a wooden stick, careful not to startle the animals. The crack echoes faintly in the enclosed space. Ice fragments drift aside as liquid water appears beneath. It has long been observed that winter livestock care required relentless repetition. Water froze, you broke it, feed ran low. You rationed carefully, shelter shifted under snow weight. You reinforced beams when possible. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was necessary. You scoop measured portions of hay from a stack in the corner, distributing it evenly. The dry scent rises as you shake it loose. The cow lowers her head and begins to chew slowly, rhythmically. The sound is soothing, almost meditative. A lesser known but intriguing note from some rural diaries mentions that people sometimes brought smaller animals into the cabin during the harshest cold snaps, especially newborn lambs or weak chickens. The shared warmth could mean the difference between life and loss. You glance toward your cabin and imagine a small crate near the hearth, feathers fluttering in firelight. The barn roof creaks softly as wind brushes across it. You step back and look upward, assessing the snow load. It seems stable for now. Still, you make a mental note to clear excess from the edges later if the weather allows. There has been considerable scholarly discussion about how frontier households balanced emotional attachment to animals with practical necessity. Some accounts describe deep affection, others emphasize strict utility. Standing here watching the steady blink of a cow's dark eye, you sense that the line between affection and necessity blurs easily in winter. When you depend on each other, sentiment grows naturally. You check the chickens next. Their combs are pale but intact. Frostbite is a real threat in extreme cold. You scatter grains sparingly, watching them peck in quick, precise movements. Their energy contrasts with the slow chewing of larger animals. When you step back outside, the cold feels harsher after the relative warmth of the barn. It bites at your nose and stiffens your fingers, even through gloves. Snow glints under pale sunlight, almost blinding. You pause for a moment in the clearing, scanning for tracks. A thin set of prints crosses the far edge near the tree line, small, delicate. Perhaps a fox passed during the night. The awareness tightens your focus. Predators move more boldly in winter when food grows scarce. Returning to the cabin, you brush snow from your boots before stepping inside. The door closes with a solid thud, sealing you back into the warmer air. Smoke from the hearth greets you gently. The difference between inside and outside feels profound every time. You remove outer layers, slowly letting them warm near the fire. Your fingers tingle as circulation returns. You kneel to stir the coals, adding a modest log to maintain steady heat. Caring for animals in the bitter dark reshapes your daily rhythm. You cannot linger long in comfort. Responsibility pulls you back into the cold each morning and evening. It is a tether that keeps you connected to the wider landscape even when snow attempts to isolate you. You prepare a simple meal and sit near the hearth, reflecting on the barn's quiet warmth. The animals do not question winter. They endure it. They respond to your presence with simple needs. Water, feed, shelter. There is a grounding quality to that simplicity. Researchers have debated how livestock survival rates fluctuated during especially severe winters in remote settlements, noting that losses could devastate small households. That knowledge hums quietly in the background of your thoughts. You understand that your vigilance matters. As afternoon fades, you plan your second trip to the barn. Evening feeding is just as important. The routine becomes a framework for the day. Outside wind sweeps lightly across the clearing again, lifting powder into faint swirling shapes. Inside the cabin remains steady, the fire glows, water buckets wait near the hearth. Winter is relentless, but not chaotic. It follows patterns, morning care, midday maintenance, evening vigilance. And as you sit with hands extended toward the fire, you know that beyond these walls, animals shift, in straw, relying on you as much as you rely on them. The frozen month's survival is shared. Evening gathers slowly, like a curtain drawn one careful inch at a time. You notice it first in the window. The pale winter light that seemed so bright against snow begins to dull, turning from silver to a faint lavender grey. The forest edge softens, details blur. Inside the cabin, the hearth grows more prominent, its glow spreading across the floor in a warm oval. Managing light in winter is almost as important as managing heat. It is firmly established in household records from the 18th and 19th centuries that artificial light was costly and often rationed carefully in rural homes. Candles required time and labour to produce, whether from tallow or beeswax, and oil for lamps was not always abundant in remote areas. You glance at your small supply of candles and feel their weight in more than wax. You do not light one immediately. Instead, you adjust your position closer to the hearth. Firelight alone can sustain much of the evening if you sit within its reach. You move your stool into the brightest patch and begin sorting small tasks that require attention. The cabin transforms as shadows lengthen. Tools hanging on pegs cast elongated silhouettes. The water bucket reflects a trembling ribbon of orange light. Your own shadow stretches tall along the wall, exaggerated and wavering. Eventually you reach for a candle. You trim the wick carefully with a small knife, knowing that an untrimmed wick produces excessive smoke and wastes fuel. You touch the flame from the hearth to the wick, and it catches with a soft bloom of light. The candle's glow is steady but modest, a small companion to the larger fire. A lesser-known but delightful detail from certain rural communities recounts that some families reserved beeswax candles for special occasions, relying on more pungent tallow candles for everyday use. Beeswax burned cleaner and smelled faintly sweet, while tallow often carried a faint scent of animal fat. You lift your candle to your nose briefly and catch a mild, slightly white odour. It is practical, You place the candle on a simple wooden stand near the table and notice how it changes the room's mood. The light is softer than the hearth, less dramatic. It fills corners that the fire cannot quite reach. There has been ongoing discussion among historians about how extended winter darkness influenced social routines in isolated cabins. Some suggest that evenings were structured around storytelling, mending, and quiet reflection. Others argue that fatigue from daylight labour often led to early sleep once tasks were complete. Sitting here, you sense how both might be true. Energy is precious, yet the long night invites conversation, even if only with yourself. You take up a small wooden cup and polish its rim with a scrap of cloth. The candlelight makes the grain glow faintly. Outside, darkness thickens. The window now reflects only the interior scene. Beyond it, the forest has disappeared into a uniform black. The soundscape shifts too. Without daylight activity, subtle noises grow more noticeable. The gentle hiss of the hearth, the faint tick of cooling iron, the quiet whisper of wind along the roofline. You experiment by snuffing the candle briefly, relying solely on firelight. Instantly, the cabin feels more intimate, almost cave-like. Shadows move more dramatically. Depth perception shifts. You relight the candle and appreciate the added clarity. Even a single small flame alters perception. It is commonly acknowledged that before widespread electrification, evenings in rural settings were governed by the availability of light. Activities requiring precision were often completed before dusk. What remained were tasks suited to dimmer conditions. You thread a needle once more and test whether the candle provides sufficient brightness. It does, though you must lean closer than you would like. You pause and simply watch the candle burn. The flame wavers gently, responding to subtle air currents. Wax softens at the base and pulls slightly before hardening again. Time feels visible in the slow shortening of the taper. An intriguing aside from certain frontier memoirs notes that children were sometimes warned not to waste candlelight by reading too long at night, as each inch of wax represented hours of labour. The idea that light itself carried measurable cost lingers in your thoughts. You find yourself instinctively conserving it, extinguishing the flame when you step away even briefly. As night deepens, you settle into a quiet routine. A small cup of warm water, a few careful stitches in a torn seam, a glance towards the door latch to ensure it sits secure. The cabin feels self-contained, a glowing island in a sea of darkness. There has been thoughtful debate among researchers regarding whether the long winter evenings fostered stronger oral traditions in remote communities. Some evidence suggests that stories flourished precisely because light was limited and distractions were few. In the gentle pool of candlelight, imagination had room to breathe. You extinguish the candle at last, pinching the wick carefully to avoid excess smoke. The room returns to the dominance of the hearth. Its glow pulses softly steady and reassuring. You sit for a moment longer, letting your eyes adjust. The cabin hums with contained warmth. Outside, the forest stands silent and unseen. Candles, shadows, and long evenings weave together into a rhythm that feels both fragile and enduring. Light must be tended just as carefully as flame. Darkness is not the enemy here. It is simply another element to manage. And as you prepare for sleep banking the fire once more, you understand that each small flame you kindle in this frozen season carries more than illumination. It carries intention. It carries patience. It carries the quiet promise that even in the longest night you can make your own circle of light. The cabin speaks most clearly in the coldest hours. You wake sometime before dawn, not from a dream, but from a sharp, clean crack that slices through the quiet. For a moment your heart lifts in alarm. The sound echoes once against the log walls and then dissolves into stillness. You lie still listening. Another sound follows. A softer pop this time, almost like a knuckle flexing, then silence again. This is the language of timber in deep frost, when temperatures plunge far below freezing wood contracts. It tightens along its grain, releasing tension in sudden audible shifts. Early settlers often wrote about these midnight reports from their cabins, noting how the logs seemed to protest the cold. What sounds alarming at first becomes familiar with repetition. You sit up slowly and glance towards the hearth. The coals are low but steady. The room is colder than when you fell asleep. The air carries a sharper edge and your breath hangs visible in front of you. You rise to add a modest piece of wood, careful not to overfeed the fire at this delicate hour. As the flames catch, the cabin responds again. A faint creak travels along the ceiling beam above you. It is not a sign of collapse but of adjustment. The structure flexes in subtle ways. It's broadly accepted among architectural historians that early log cabins were designed with a certain tolerance for movement. Settlers understood that freshly cut logs would shrink as they dried, and that seasonal temperature shifts would cause expansion and contraction. Gaps were expected, repairs were routine, perfection was never the goal, stability was. You move your hand along the interior wall and feel the cold radiating through the wood. The surface is firm and slightly rough. In some places the chinking feels harder than before, as if frozen solid. Another sound ripples through the structure. This one is longer, a drawn-out groan that travels from one end of the cabin to the other. You pause, hand resting on the wall, and let it finish. There is something oddly reassuring about these noises once you recognize their pattern. They mean the logs are intact, responding rather than failing. A curious anecdote from certain northern settlements describes families naming particularly vocal beams in their homes, joking about Old Sam or Crooked Mary, complaining about the cold. It was a way of domesticating the sound, turning potential fear into familiarity. You consider whether the beam above your bed deserves a name of its own. The fire strengthens gradually and warmth spreads outward. The sharpness in the air softens slightly. With heat comes another round of subtle adjustments. The logs that tighten now begin to expand, producing a different tone of sound, softer, lower. Researchers continue to examine how winter stress affected the longevity of early wooden structures. Some argue that repeated freeze and thaw cycles accelerated deterioration, while others suggest that well-maintained cabins endured longer than we often assume. Standing here in the quiet glow, you sense how maintenance and attention make all the difference. You check the roofline from inside, scanning for fine dust falling from between beams. None appears. The chimney remains steady, drawing smoke upward without backflow. These small confirmations ease your mind. Outside wind brushes against the wall, amplifying certain sounds. A loose shutter edge rattles briefly before settling. Snow slides from the roof in a muted cascade. Inside the cabin remains upright and warm enough. The sounds once startling now form part of the night's rhythm, crack, creak, stumble. You sit on the edge of your bedding and wrap your blanket around your shoulders. There is a quiet intimacy in witnessing a structure respond to cold in real time. The cabin is not static, it breathes in its own way, it shifts, it adapts. Another sharp pop comes from the far wall. You do not jump this time. You tilt your head slightly, listening to the way it echoes. The pitch is different from earlier. Higher, perhaps closer to the surface of a log rather than deep within its core. There has been thoughtful debate among preservation experts about whether modern reconstructions can ever fully replicate the acoustics of original log cabins. Age, moisture content, and timber species all influence the soundscape. Here in this isolated clearing, the acoustics feel personal. Each noise carries context. You add one more small piece of wood and settle back down. The firelight flickers across the beams, highlighting their uneven surfaces. In that shifting glow, the cabin appears almost alive. Gradually the temperature stabilizes again. The sharpest creaks diminish. The logs settle into a temporary equilibrium. You close your eyes and listen not with anxiety now, but with curiosity. The structure that shields you from wind and frost communicates constantly if you are willing to hear it. In a frozen winter, silence is never absolute. It is textured with the voice of timber adjusting to cold. As you drift back towards a sleep, another faint crack sounds in the distance, this time from the forest beyond. A tree perhaps releasing tension under the weight of ice. The world outside speaks too, but within these walls the sounds are familiar, contained. They remind you that survival is not only about warmth and food, it is about understanding the materials around you, learning their habits, trusting their strength while respecting their limits. The cabin contracts and settles, though the fire glows steadily, and you, wrapped in wool and listening closely, learn to rest within the language of wood in winter. Illness feels closer in winter, not dramatic at first, just nearer. You notice it in the way your throat feels slightly raw one morning, as if the air itself has brushed it too sharply during the night. The cabin is warm enough, the fire steady, yet the dryness from constant smoke and heated air lingers in your chest. You clear your throat and listen to the sound echo faintly in the small room. Winter in a remote cabin narrows your options. There is no apothecary a short walk away, no physician within easy reach. It is well documented in early rural records that families relied heavily on home remedies passed down through memory and handwritten notes, especially when travel was impossible due to snow. You understand that if you grow truly unwell here, care will come from your own hands. You warm a small pot of water and add dried herbs stored carefully in a cloth pouch. The scent rises slowly, sharp and earthy. Steam curls upward, carrying the fragrance toward your face. You lean over the pot and inhale gently, feeling warmth spread through your sinuses. The herbs were gathered months ago, dried in late summer sunlight, bundled and hung from ceiling beams. Their presence now feels like a gift from a warmer season. Mint for breath, thyme for cough, perhaps a pinch of dried willow bark if pain insists. There are accounts from isolated settlements describing how knowledge of medicinal plants was often as valuable as knowledge of hunting or farming. Some remedies were effective, others relied more on belief than chemistry. Researchers continue to examine which traditional treatments had measurable benefits and which functioned primarily as comfort rituals. Sitting here, you suspect that comfort itself has power. You sip the infusion slowly. The liquid is hot enough to make your eyes water. It slides down your throat with a faint bitterness that you welcome. Warmth spreads through your chest and settles there. Outside, the world remains frozen and distant. The forest offers no assistance. Illness in winter isolates you further. Even a mild fever would make the simple act of hauling wood feel monumental. You test your forehead with the back of your hand. Cool enough? For now, this is just dryness, perhaps a whisper of irritation rather than true sickness. Still, you add extra fuel to the hearth, ensuring steady heat. A small but intriguing detail appears in certain rural memoirs recounting how some families hung small bundles of dried herbs near doorways during winter, believing the scent to ward off illness. Whether by superstition or subtle air purification, the practice persisted. You glance toward the beam above your door where a faded cluster of sage hangs brittle and grey. You decide to air out the cabin briefly despite the cold. Opening the door for even a minute allows a rush of sharp, clean air to sweep through. It is bracing. Your eyes sting, yet the smoke thins and the atmosphere feels refreshed. You close the door quickly, sealing warmth back inside. Illness without easy escape carries a particular weight. There are no quick remedies, only patience and observation. You listen to your own breathing as you sit near the hearth. It remains steady. Your limbs feel strong enough. There has long been a discussion among historians about how communities managed contagious illness during harsh winters when isolation was already intense. Some suggest that remoteness limited spread. Others argue that confined spaces amplified it within households. Alone here, the question feels theoretical but sobering. You prepare a simple broth for midday using minimal effort. Steam fills the air again, carrying moisture that soothes your throat slightly. You add a bit more water than usual, allowing the warmth to linger longer. As afternoon light fades, you wrap yourself in an extra layer and rest without fully lying down. You watch the fire. You measure your energy carefully. Even minor ailments must be respected in a frozen landscape. The cabin seems quieter today, or perhaps you're more attentive. Every creak, every hiss from the hearth feels amplified. You notice how the warmth gathers near your feet, how the cooler air lingers just above head height. You recall that in some early frontier accounts, neighbours travelled miles through snow to assist one another during serious illness, forming small networks of mutual aid. Such journeys were risky but undertaken when necessary. The thought brings both comfort and humility. You're not entirely alone in spirit, even if physically distant. By evening, your throat feels less raw. The warm air and herbal steam have softened the irritation. You add one more small bundle of dried leaves to the pot, letting their scent mingle with smoke. Outside, snow glows faintly under a rising moon. Inside, the hearth hums gently. Illness has brushed past you lightly today, a reminder of vulnerability rather than a full claim. You respond with care, with warmth, with patience. In a remote log cabin during frozen winter, health is not taken for granted. It is tended like fire, watched closely, adjusted carefully. You finish your broth and settle back against the wall, wrapped in wool and quiet resolve. The night will come as it always does. The cold will press against the logs. But for now, your breath is steady, your pulse is calm, and the small circle of warmth within these walls holds firm. Children change the sound of winter. Even in a small cabin, their presence alters the rhythm of the day. The quiet that once felt heavy becomes punctuated by whispers, by sudden laughter, by the soft thud of small boots against packed earth. You notice how the air itself seems less still when young voices move through it. Space is limited. The cabin walls do not expand to accommodate restless energy, yet somehow children adapt. They learn the boundaries quickly. The hearth is hot, the door latch is not a toy, the water bucket must remain upright. It is widely recorded in early settlement accounts that winter months were often when basic literacy lessons took place, particularly in remote households where formal schooling was seasonal or distant. With fields frozen and outdoor labour reduced, evenings near the fire became informal classrooms. You sit on a low stool and trace simple letters into a thin layer of ash near the hearth, watching curious eyes follow the shapes. A stick becomes a pointer. A scrap of wood becomes a slate. The cabin transforms briefly into a place of instruction. The firelight flickers across faces intent on understanding marks that represent sound. Restlessness arrives quickly, though. After a few lines practiced carefully, attention wanders. Small hands reach toward the warmth, then toward each other. A giggle escapes before it can be contained. There are preserved anecdotes from rural memoirs describing how children created elaborate indoor games during heavy snowfall, turning benches into imaginary wagons, or pretending the narrow strip between wall and table was a frozen river to be crossed carefully. The imagination compensates for confinement. You watch as a simple wooden spoon becomes a brave explorer navigating a world of snowdrifts represented by folded blankets. Scholars have long discussed whether prolonged winter confinement strengthened family bonds or heightened tension within tight quarters. Diaries offer evidence for both outcomes. Some writers describe cozy evenings of shared stories and songs. Others hint at frayed patience and quick tempers. In this small space, you sense how easily the balance could tip either way. You assign small tasks to channel energy. One gathers kindling from the basket. Another folds worn cloth near the hearth. A third counts the remaining beans in a jar, turning rationing into arithmetic practice. The cabin hums with purposeful motion. The fire crackles softly, offering both warmth and a focal point. You remind them gently not to move too close. The lesson is repeated often. Winter tolerates no carelessness. Midday arrives in a watch of pale light through the oiled paper window. Outside, snow rests in smooth layers undisturbed, except for faint animal tracks at the edge of the clearing. Inside, the air grows warmer for both flame and movement. You prepare a simple meal, dividing portions carefully. Even modest food seems brighter when accompanied by small voices. The clink of wooden bowls and the scrape of spoons create a quiet symphony. It has been suggested by some historians that storytelling during winter evenings played a crucial role in passing down cultural memory in isolated communities. Without printed materials readily available, oral tradition carried history, cautionary tales, and humour from one generation to the next. You begin a simple story while the light fades, watching faces lean closer to catch every word. The cabin walls seem to absorb the narrative. Shadows stretch and contract as the fire shifts. A tale about a clever fox navigating deep snow feels particularly fitting tonight. A lesser-known yet charming custom in certain frontier regions involved creating small, handcrafted toys during winter downtime, often carved from leftover wood scraps. These objects were rarely elaborate, but carried deep meaning because they represented time and attention. You glance at a roughly shaped wooden animal resting on the table and feel a quiet satisfaction. As evening deepens, energy finally begins to ebb. The children grow quieter, movements slower. Wool blankets are arranged near the hearth in careful layers. There is a ritual to bedtime. Boots placed neatly, scarves hung to dry. The cabin, once lively, returns gradually to softer sounds. Breathing steadies. Occasional murmurs fade. Researchers continue to examine how winter childhood experiences in remote settings shaped resilience and independence later in life. Some argue that early exposure to hardship fostered adaptability. Others caution against romanticizing the strain. Sitting here watching small forms settle into sleep, you recognize both truths. You bank the fire gently, ensuring it will last through the night. The glow softens, bathing the room in amber. The presence of children changes winter from a solitary endurance into a shared journey. Their curiosity fills spaces that might otherwise echo with isolation. Their laughter briefly challenges the cold pressing against the logs. Outside, the forest remains silent, indifferent to games and lessons. Inside, warmth lingers not only from flame but from company. You sit for a few moments longer, listening to the steady rhythm of sleeping breath. The cabin feels fuller, though its dimensions have not changed. In a remote log cabin during frozen months, children bring motion to stillness, questions to silence, and lightness to a season defined by restraint. And as you finally stretch out near the hearth, you realize that winter's weight feels different when carried together. The road beyond your clearing is invisible, yet you think about it often. There are no hoof prints today, no wagon ruts cutting through snow, no distant figures moving between trees. Still, you imagine the faint line that connects this cabin to the wider world. Somewhere beyond the forest, another hearth burns. Somewhere someone writes by candlelight. You sit at the small table near the window and unfold a sheet of paper saved carefully for this purpose. Paper is not abundant here. Each page carries value beyond its surface. Ink is mixed sparingly, the nib of your pen trimmed with attention. It is well understood from frontier correspondence that letters were lifelines during long winters, sometimes travelling weeks before reaching their destination. Roads became impassable, rivers froze, and messages waited in saddlebags until conditions allowed movement again. You dip your pen and begin slowly forming each word with deliberate care. The act of writing feels intimate in this quiet space. You describe the snow that has buried the path. You mention the steady health of livestock. You speak of the cabin's resilience in deep frost. There is comfort in shaping experience into sentences, even if no one reads them for months. A small but fascinating custom appears in certain rural communities where letters were read aloud repeatedly after arrival, shared among neighbours who gathered to hear news from distant towns. In that way, one sheet of paper carried multiple voices. You picture your own words travelling beyond this clearing, becoming part of a larger conversation. There has been thoughtful discussion among historians about whether isolation heightened emotional expression in frontier letters. Some scholars suggest that distance encouraged greater candour. Others argue that brevity was often necessary due to cost and scarcity of materials. As you write, you find yourself balancing honesty with restraint. You pause occasionally, lifting your gaze to the window. Snow reflects pale light into the room. The forest stands motionless. Silence presses gently against the glassless frame covered in oiled paper. You describe small victories: a well-banked fire, a repaired sleeve, a night without illness. These details may seem minor, yet they carry weight here. Winter magnifies small successes. Ink dries slowly in the cool air. You wave the page gently near the hearth, careful not to scorch its edge. The faint scent of smoke touches the paper, marking it subtly with the cabin's atmosphere. Loneliness in winter is not always loud. It does not always arrive with tears or despair. Sometimes it appears quietly in the pause between tasks and the long stretch of afternoon when wind falls silent and there is no sound but your own breathing. Writing becomes a bridge across that stillness. It has been noted in early settlement diaries that people often wrote not only to inform but to reassure both sender and recipient that life continued steadily despite harsh conditions. The letter itself became proof of endurance. You fold the page carefully and tuck it into a small cloth pouch ready for the next opportunities to send it. That opportunity may come with a travelling trader or a neighbour, braving the snow when weather softens. For now, the letter waits. A curious anecdote preserved in certain memoirs recounts how some settlers kept unsent letters tucked beneath mattresses for months, rereading them as a way of feeling connected before any messenger appeared. You consider whether you might do the same if winter stretches longer than expected. As afternoon fades, you step outside, briefly scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Nothing. The snow remains smooth and undisturbed. Back inside, you add a small log to the hearth and sit once more at the table. The empty space where the letter lay a moment ago feels slightly different now, as though something has shifted. You have spoken into the distance, even if the distance has not answered. Researchers continue to explore how communication networks shaped emotional resilience in remote settlements. Letters, rumours, shared at rare gatherings all contributed, she said, to a sense of belonging beyond immediate walls. Even the expectation of the eventual contact sustained hope. You pour a small cup of warm water and cradle it between your hands. The cabin glows softly. Shadows gather near the ceiling beams. Loneliness and letter writing intertwine in this frozen season. One sharpens the other. Silence deepens the desire to speak. You look again towards the hidden road. Beneath the snow it still exists. Beneath the silence, connections persist. The forest may seem endless, the clearing isolated, yet your words travel in imagination if not yet in fact. Night settles slowly. You secure the latch, check the water buckets, adjust the wood near the hearth. Routine continues, steady and grounding. As you lie down near the fire, you think of the folded page waiting patiently in its pouch. It holds more than ink. It holds proof that you are here, living through frozen weeks, tending flame and livestock, sealing cracks and thawing water. And somewhere beyond the snowbound trees, someone else waits for news carried by careful hands across winter roads. In this way, even when the cabin feels like the entire world, you remember that it is part of something larger, connected by ink, by memory, by hope. Hunting in winter feels like stepping into a different world entirely. The forest that seems distant and decorative from your window becomes intimate and demanding once you cross the edge of the clearing. You prepare carefully before leaving. Extra wool layer. Scarf wrapped tight, knife secured, powder kept dry. The hearth is banked, the door latched firmly behind you. Cold air greets you like a wall, it sharpens every sensation. Your nostrils sting. The inside of your lungs feels almost crisp as you breathe deeply. Snow crunches beneath your boots in a steady rhythm that you try to soften instinctively. It is a well-established historical reality that winter hunting was both essential and perilous in remote settlements. Stored meat rarely lasted the entire season without supplementation, and fresh protein could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and slow depletion. At the same time, snow revealed tracks, clearly making both prey and predator easier to follow. You pause at the tree line and study the ground. Tracks cross the clearing edge. Some are old edges softened by drifting powder. Others are recent, crisp and defined. You kneel and examine one set carefully. The imprint is narrow, elongated, perhaps deer. The forest absorbs sound differently than the clearing. Snow dampens your steps, but it also carries small noises farther through still air. You move slowly, each foot placed with intention. Branches overhead hold thin layers of frost that shimmer faintly in pale light. A curious detail preserved in certain hunting journals recounts that experienced winter hunters sometimes listened more than they looked, tuning their ears to subtle differences in wind through branches or the distant snap of a twig under weight. You pause now and let silence settle around you, focusing on the faintest disturbances. There has been considerable academic discussion about how sustainable early winter hunting practices were in remote areas. Some scholars argue that settlers learned quickly to avoid overharvesting in harsh seasons. Others suggest that desperation occasionally led to depletion of nearby game. Standing here, you feel the weight of that balance. You follow the deer tracks deeper into the forest. They weave between trees, occasionally pausing where bark has been nibbled. The prints are clear against untouched snow, each hoof mark a small hollow shadow. Cold begins to seep gradually into your boots despite thick wool. You flex your toes subtly to maintain circulation. Breath escapes in visible plumes that linger briefly before dissolving. A distant sound halts you, not loud but distinct. A soft crack perhaps from a shifting branch or an animal stepping lightly. You crouch, steadying your breathing. The forest feels suspended, every tree upright and watchful. Winter hunting is as much patience as pursuit. You wait. Minutes stretch quietly. Finally you glimpse movement through a narrow opening between trunks. A deer head lowered, scraping snow aside to reach dormant grass beneath. You move gurlily into position. The cold seems to pause with you. Time narrows. The forest fades to a frame around the animal's form. Moments later the stillness breaks. The shot echoes sharply, reverberating through trees and scattering a few startled birds from distant branches. Silence returns almost immediately, thicker than before. You approach with measured steps, aware of both gratitude and gravity. Fresh meat in winter carries profound significance. It will be stretched carefully, portions preserved near the hearth, perhaps dried further if conditions allow. Historical accounts frequently note that nothing from a winter kill was wasted. Meat, hide, bones, sinew each found use in some capacity. Efficiency was not merely virtuous, it was necessary. You work methodically, hands growing numb despite gloves. The smell of iron and frost mingles faintly in the air. Snow beneath darkens slightly where life has met cold. You move with quiet respect, completing what must be done before temperature stiffens everything beyond practicality. As you drag your prize back towards the clearing, effort burns in your shoulders. Snow resists, the path feels longer returning than it did leaving. Back at the cabin, smoke curls steadily from the chimney. The sight brings relief. You prop the door open briefly and maneuver carefully inside, closing it quickly to preserve warmth. The hearth's glow seems brighter now, welcoming. You begin the work of preparing the meat for storage, trimming carefully hanging portions in the cooler section of the cabin where air circulates but warmth does not spoil it. Researchers continue to examine how winter protein intake influenced physical endurance in isolated communities. Evidence suggests that access to fresh meat significantly bolstered resilience during long cold months. You sense that truth in your tired limbs as you sit briefly to rest. Hunting in frozen forests carries risk and reward intertwined. It demands alertness, patience, and physical strength. It connects you directly to the land in a way no stored beans or dried herbs can replicate. As evening falls, the cabin smells faintly of smoke and fresh preparation. Outside tracks from your journey cut a narrow line through snow proof of the day's labour. You sit near the hearth, muscles aching, and let warmth seep back into your hands. The forest beyond has resumed its silence, indifferent once more. Winter continues, yet today you have stepped into it rather than simply enduring it from behind walls. And as flames flicker gently across the cabin logs, you recognize that survival here depends not only on sealing cracks and rationing wood, but on meeting the frozen world on its own terms. The storm announces itself long before the first true gust arrives. You feel it in the air during late afternoon, a subtle shift in pressure that makes the forest seem to hold its breath. The sky fades from pale blue to a dense metallic grey. Snow that once rested quietly on branches begins to loosen, drifting downward in small, uncertain spirals. Inside the cabin, you sense the change without needing to look. The hearth flickers slightly, flames leaning sideways as drafts alter their path. You add an extra log, not out of panic, but preparation. Meteorological records from early settlements indicate that winter blizzards in remote forested regions could last anywhere from a few hours to several relentless days, often accompanied by fierce winds that piled snow against walls and blocked doors entirely. You glance at the entrance and imagine drifts climbing slowly upward. The first true gust hits with a low, sustained moan. It slides along the cabin's exterior like a broad hand testing the seams. Snow lifts from the clearing and hurls itself against the logs in fine, dry waves. You secure the latch firmly and check the window covering. The oiled paper trembles slightly but holds. Wind does not simply blow. It presses, it pushes, it searches. The roof responds with a muted groan. One of the beams above shifts slightly, a reminder that even well-built structures flex under pressure. You sit close to the hearth, listening carefully. The sound of timber adjusting in cold now mingles with the deeper roar of storm. It is as though two conversations overlap. A small but intriguing note found in certain frontier memoirs describes how families sometimes wedged extra cloth or straw along door thresholds during blizzards to prevent fine snow from slipping inside. You kneel and press a folded scrap along the bottom edge of the door, feeling cold air retreat slightly. There has been sustained academic interest in how isolated households mentally prepared for prolonged storms. Some historians suggest that familiarity bred calm. Others argue that each new storm carried fresh anxiety because no two were identical. You feel both reactions stirring quietly within you. Snow begins to accumulate visibly against the lower half of the door. Through a narrow gap near the frame, you see white rising steadily. Wind whistles through tiny imperfections in the chinking despite your careful repairs. The hearth becomes your anchor. Its glow steadies your breathing. You adjust the fire carefully, maintaining a balance that will last through hours of confinement. Outside, the storm intensifies. Gusts slam against the walls in rhythmic bursts. Snow rattles briefly against the roof before sliding downward in heavy sheets. The forest beyond the clearing disappears entirely, swallowed by swirling white. You think of the barn and the animals inside. You've imagined them shifting in straw, listening to the same wind from their side of wooden walls. Their shelter must hold as yours does. A well-documented fact from rural settlement studies is that blizzards frequently reshape the immediate landscape, burying fences, altering paths, and even collapsing weaker outbuildings. The morning after often revealed a transformed world. The cabin shudders lightly during a particularly strong gust. You glance upwards instinctively. The beam holds. The roof does not lift. You move through small tasks, deliberately keeping motion steady to avoid spiraling thoughts. Stir the coals, check the water bucket, reposition a stool slightly away from a draft. These gestures create a sense of agency in a storm that does not care about your preferences. A curious tradition noted in certain rural communities involved gathering near the hearth during blizzards to sing softly, believing that steady human sound somehow balanced the wild noise outside. You do not sing, but you speak quietly to yourself once or twice, if only to remind the walls that you are here. Hours stretch. The storm does not fade quickly. Wind continues its relentless testing of seams and corners. Snow rises higher against the door, now reaching midway up its frame. Researchers continue to examine how repeated exposure to severe winter storms influenced architectural improvements in frontier regions. Over time, designs evolved, roofs steepened, foundations reinforced. But in this moment, evolution offers little comfort. You rely on the structure you have. Eventually, fatigue seeps in. You bank the fire more generously than usual, anticipating a long night of listening. You lay bedding closer to the hearth, minimizing distance from warmth. As darkness merges with swirling snow, The world beyond your cabin dissolves into sound and motion. Inside the glow of firelight, create this magical sanctuary. Storm nights demand endurance rather than action. You cannot calm the wind. You cannot halt the falling snow. You can only maintain the small circle of heat and hope within these walls. The roof creaks once more, snow thuds against the exterior. You lie down, wrapped in wool eyes, half-closed ears alert to every shift. The storm continues its conversation with the cabin, loud and insistent. Yet the logs hold, the hearth burns, and through the relentless wind you understand that resilience is not silence in the face of noise. It is steady warmth in the midst of it. When the storm finally loosens its grip, the world feels altered. You wake to a strange quiet deeper even than before. No wind presses against the walls, no snow rattles at the roof. For a moment you wonder if you've gone deaf, then you hear it. The faint drip of melting frost somewhere along the eaves. You rise and push gently against the door. It resists. Snow is packed tightly against the outside. You lean harder, shoulder against wood, and feel it give slightly. A thin seam of white light appears along the edge. Clearing the doorway becomes your first task. You shovel from inside, at first scraping snow back into the cabin to create space for the door to open wider. Cold air floods in once the gap widens enough sharp and bracing. Outside the clearing is unrecognizable. Drifts curve in smooth ridges. Fence posts have vanished entirely. The path to the barn is erased. Even the shape of the woodpile has softened beneath a thick white blanket. It's widely acknowledged in frontier studies that late winter rather than early often proved the most difficult period for remote households. By that point, food stores had diminished, energy reserves waned, and repeated storms compounded earlier challenges. You glance toward your root cellar hatch and feel a quiet tension in your chest. Inside the cellar, stored vegetables rest in shallow bins. Potatoes have sprouted faint white shoots. Carrots are slightly shriveled at their tips. You sort them carefully, separating those that must be used soon from those still firm. Salted meat hangs in the cooler corner of the cabin, reduced now to smaller portions. You calculate silently. How many weeks remain before thaw? How many meals can be stretched from what you have? A lesser-known practice from certain northern settlements involved grinding dried peas or beans into coarse flour late in winter to create thicker stews that felt more substantial despite smaller quantities. You consider whether your remaining beans might serve that purpose if needed. There has been extensive scholarly discussion about how accurately settlers estimated their winter provisions. Some researchers suggest that experience sharpened planning over time, while others note that unpredictable weather could undo even the most careful preparation. Standing in your cellar, you sense how thin the margin can be. You carry a modest basket of vegetables back upstairs and prepare a thin soup, adding more water than usual. The aroma is earthy and faintly sweet. Steam rises and fills the cabin with gentle warmth. Outside, the sun glints brilliantly off untouched drifts. The air remains cold, but there is a subtle shift in its tone, a faint hint of something less severe. You force yourself to eat slowly, savouring each spoonful. Rationing requires discipline. Hunger is persuasive, especially after days of storm. After the meal, you step carefully toward the barn, carving a narrow path through snow. Each step sinks deeply. The journey feels longer than usual. Animals greet you with quiet movements, their needs unchanged by your calculations. Back inside, you examine the remaining woodpile. The stack stands lower now, more gaps visible between logs. You count roughly, enough for now, but not abundance. It has been noted in several historical analyses that winter scarcity often fostered remarkable creativity in frontier kitchens, from stretching broth with additional grains to inventing new uses for preserved fat. Necessity shaped cuisine as much as taste did. You sit near the hearth and mend a small tear in a grain sack, careful to prevent further loss. Even spilled kernels matter now. There is a particular kind of alertness that comes with dwindling supplies. You find yourself scanning shelves, more often adjusting portions by instinct rather than strict measurement. Researchers continue to explore how communities coped psychologically with late winter shortages. Some accounts emphasize quiet resolve and mutual aid. Others describe tension and worry that deepened as stores thinned. Alone in your cabin, you experience both caution and calm in alternating waves. As afternoon fades, you step outside once more. The storm's sculpted drifts glow pale gold under low sunlight. Somewhere beneath that so-early shoots lie dormant waiting. Inside, the fire burns steadily. You add a smaller log than usual, preserving the larger ones for colder nights still to come. Food stores running low does not signal immediate crisis. It signals attentiveness. Every meal becomes deliberate, every scrap valued. You settle into your stool and extend your hands toward the heat. The cabin smells of simmering vegetables and smoke. Winter is not finished, but you are still here measuring, adjusting, enduring. And as the sun dips behind the forest edge, casting long shadows across untouched snow, you understand that survival in these months is not a single triumph. It is a series of careful decisions made one bowl, one log, one stored carrot at a time. By the time winter has settled deep into your bones, logic no longer feels like the only guide. The fire burns low and steady tonight, casting a softer glow than usual. Outside the clearing lies still beneath a pale wash of moonlight. Snow reflects that light faintly through the window, giving the cabin an almost silver undertone. You sit close to the hearth, not out of necessity this time, but out of instinct. There is something about long winter evenings that invites reflection. The world shrinks to flame, wood, breath. Beyond that, imagination stretches farther than your boots ever could. It's well attested in folklore collections from rural wintering communities that superstition and small protective rituals flourished during the cold months. When storms isolated households and darkness lengthened, unseen forces felt closer, more immediate. You glance toward the door and notice the dried bundle of sage hanging above it, brittle but intact. Earlier in the season, you might have dismissed such gestures as quaint. Now you understand their comfort. You reach up and adjust the bundle slightly more from habit than belief. The faint scent releases as your fingers brush it. A curious custom recorded in certain northern settlements involved placing a small iron object near the hearth, believed to guard against misfortune during fierce storms. Iron strong and forged by fire symbolized resilience. You glance at the poker resting beside the hearth and imagine that symbolism warming quietly alongside you. There has been ongoing debate among cultural historians about whether winter superstitions in frontier cabins represented genuine belief or practical psychology. Some argue that rituals provided a sense of control in unpredictable conditions. Others suggest they were inherited traditions carried from older homelands. Sitting here, you suspect both can be true without contradiction. The cabin itself takes on a different character at night. Shadows seem deeper. The corners of the room feel farther away. Even familiar creaks acquire subtle nuance. You find yourself listening more closely than usual, though nothing truly unusual occurs. You stir the coals and watch sparks lift briefly before vanishing. The sight feels almost symbolic. Small bursts of light swallowed quickly by darkness. Outside, a distant sound drifts across the clearing. A long, low call. Perhaps a wolf. The note lingers in the air before dissolving. Your pulse quickens slightly, though you know the animals rarely approach close to the cabin when firelight glows within. Still, winter has a way of amplifying possibility. You check the latch once more, pressing your palm against the wood to feel its firmness. Stories passed down through generations often centered on winter nights. Tales of wandering spirits in snow, of travelers led astray by strange lights, of animals behaving with uncanny intelligence. Whether meant as caution or entertainment, such stories found fertile ground in frozen silence. You remember one in particular about a lantern seen moving across a distant field with no figure beneath it. You glance toward the window instinctively, half expecting some flicker beyond the clearing. There is none. Only moonlit snow. The fire snaps softly. A beam above shifts with a mild groan. You exhale slowly, grounding yourself in the present moment. The cabin is solid, the hearth is steady. Researchers continue to explore how folklore served as both entertainment, armament, and moral instruction during isolated winters. Many stories reinforced practical lessons, warning children against wandering too far or venturing onto thin ice. In that way, superstition intertwined with survival. You lift a small wooden charm from the shelf near your bed, carved simply into a geometric shape. It has no official meaning beyond what you assign to it, yet holding it in your palm feels reassuring. The moonlight outside brightens briefly as clouds thin. The clearing gleams faintly untouched and silent. You pour a small cup of warm water and sit again near the hearth. The iron poker rests beside you, the sage bundle above the door, the carved charm in your hand. None of these objects alter the temperature or reinforce the walls, but they soften the edge of uncertainty. There is a quiet dignity in acknowledging fear without surrendering to it. Superstitions do not replace reason. They coexist with it, filling spaces logic cannot fully occupy. The distant howl comes again, slightly closer this time, or perhaps carried differently by wind. You listen without rising. The sound fades gradually into the forest. Inside the cabin remains warm. The animals in the barn shift softly. The woodpile stands stacked. You bank the fire carefully, covering embers with ash to preserve them through the night. The glow dims to a steady red cradle. As you lie down, shadows dance gently across the ceiling. The moonlight blends with firelight in subtle patterns. Winter nights invite both rational thought and quiet ritual. You seal cracks, ration food, tend flame. You also adjust sage bundles and hold carved charms. And as sleep approaches, you realize that in a remote log cabin surrounded by frozen forest, it is natural to carry both practicality and imagination into the dark. The storm winds may test your walls. Wolves may call from distant trees, yet within this small circle of warmth you hold steady. Firelight flickers once more, then settles. The cabin rests. Cold does not pour simply because something breaks. You discover the crack in your axe handle on a morning that feels deceptively calm. Sunlight filters cleanly through the window, covering snow outside, glittering in sharp definition. The storm has passed, the drift settled. Everything appears orderly. You lift the axe from its peg to split a small log near the doorway, and your thumb traces an unfamiliar ridge along the wood. A thin fracture runs lengthwise, subtle but unmistakable. You hold the handle up to the light and see it clearly now. In remote winter conditions, tools are extensions of the body. It is widely recognized in studies of frontier labor that maintenance of implements was as critical as food storage or firewood stacking. A broken tool in deep frost could escalate quickly from inconvenience to genuine hazard. You run your hand along the grain and feel how brittle the wood has become in prolonged cold. Repeated exposure to freeze and thaw weakens fibers. Even well-seasoned handles are not immune. You set the axe down and examine the rest of your tools. The knife blade needs sharpening. The iron kettle handle is slightly loose. A roof shingle near the chimney edge has shifted under snow weight. Repairs in sub-zero air demand patience and steady fingers. There are accounts preserved in early rural memoirs describing how families often reserved certain indoor winter days specifically for tool repair. Recognizing that prevention reduced risk later, you clear a space near the hearth and bring the axe closer to warmth, hoping to coax flexibility back into the wood before attempting reinforcement. A small but intriguing practice noted in some northern settlements involved wrapping cracked handles with strips of rawhide soaked in water. As the rawhide dried near the fire, it tightened, binding the wood more securely. You search your storage and find a thin strip preserved from autumn processing. There has been ongoing analysis among material culture historians about how frontier improvisation influenced long-term craftsmanship traditions. Some scholars argue that necessity bred innovative binding and patching techniques that later became standardized methods. Others contend that many fixes were temporary at best. As you soak the rawhide in warmed water, you suspect practicality mattered more than perfection. The cabin air grows slightly warmer as the fire burns steadily. You dry your hands and begin wrapping the softened strip tightly around the fractured section of the handle. Each loop presses the crack closed incrementally. You pull firmly, then secure the end beneath itself. You place the axe near, but not too close to the hearth, allowing the rawhide to dry gradually. The smell of damp leather mingles with smoke. As it tightens, the binding contracts, gripping the wood firmly. Next you turn to the knife. Sharpening in the cold weather requires careful positioning. Metal becomes less forgiving. You sit with a whetstone in your lap, drawing the blade across its surface in steady strokes. The scraping sound is soft but persistent. Outside wind brushes gently along the roofline. You glance upward, remembering the displaced shingle. Roof repairs in deep winter are risky, but ignoring them invites worse trouble later. A broadly accepted fact from architectural studies of early cabins is that roofs were often the most vulnerable element during heavy snowfall. Poor drainage or weakened shingles could lead to leaks once thaw began. You pull on your coat and climb carefully onto the lower edge of the roof, moving slowly to avoid slipping. Snow crunches beneath your boots. The air is crisp and bright. You press the shifted shingle back into place and secure it with a small wooden peg. Your fingers stiffen quickly despite gloves. You descend with relief once the task is complete. Back inside, warmth returns gradually to your hands. The axe handle feels firmer now, the rawhide tightened into a sturdy band. You test it lightly against a small log it holds. Researchers continue to examine how winter maintenance shaped daily routines in isolated dwellings. Many argue that constant minor repairs fostered an intimate knowledge of one's tools and structure. In such environments, nothing was truly taken for granted. You gather small fragments of wood from the floor and feed them into the hearth. The cabin smells faintly of leather iron and pine smoke. Repair work in sub-zero air demands calm focus. You cannot rush without risking further damage. You cannot delay without inviting larger failure. As afternoon light fades, you hang the reinforced axe back on its peg. The binding stands out against the worn handle, a visible reminder of winter's pressure. You sit back and survey the room. The kettle handle is tightened, the knife sharpened, the roof secured, the axe reinforced. Cold may test materials relentlessly, but attentive hands answer each challenge in turn. And as evening settles once more around your cabin, you recognize that survival in frozen months is not merely about enduring the elements. It is about constant quiet stewardship of the tools and shelter that stand between you and the cold. The snow remembers everything. You notice it the moment you step outside at dawn. The clearing lies smooth and pale, a clean sheet stretched wide beneath a faint pink ski, but along the edge near the tree line a series of fresh impressions interrupts the perfection. You stand still, breath drifting in front of you, and study the shapes. Each print is deliberate, spaced, evenly pressed deep into the powder. Not deer, not rabbit, larger. Rounded pads with faint claw marks at the front. Tracks across untouched snow carry a quiet message. Something moved while you slept. It is a commonly observed detail in accounts of winter life on the frontier, that snow transformed into a kind of ledger, recording the movement of animals and humans alike. Experienced settlers could read that ledger with surprising precision, distinguishing direction, speed, even approximate size. You crouch and trace the outline gently with your gloved finger. The prints lead from the forest edge toward the barn, then veer away again, circling wide before disappearing back into trees. You feel a subtle tightening in your chest. Curiosity mingles with caution. A lesser-known but fascinating practice described in some rural memoirs involves sprinkling a thin line of ash or scattering small branches near outbuildings to better detect animal movement overnight. The contrast against snow made disturbances easier to see. You make a mental note of this for future evenings. There has been considerable scholarly conversation about how frequently predators approached remote cabins during severe winters. Some historians suggest such encounters were rarer than popular imagination implies. Others cite diary entries describing wolves or wildcats drawn closer by scarce prey. Standing here now, you suspect the truth varies by region and season. You follow the tracks cautiously toward the barn boots, sinking into your own fresh impressions beside them. The air feels sharper this morning, though perhaps that is your imagination amplifying it. Inside the barn, the animals seem calm. The cow shifts lazily. Chickens cluck softly, no sign of panic. You check the latch, carefully ensuring it holds firm. Back outside, you walk the perimeter of the clearing. The tracks remain consistent, no sudden dashes or deep lunges. The animal likely circled out of curiosity, perhaps testing scent carried on wind. You straighten and look toward the forest. The trees stand dark and silent. Snow clings to branches in uneven clusters. Somewhere within that line of trunks, unseen eyes may have watched your cabin glow through the night. It's well documented in frontier survival narratives that awareness of surrounding wildlife shaped nightly routines. Doors were checked twice, tools kept within reach, livestock secured carefully before dusk. Such vigilance was not paranoia, but prudence. You return inside and close the door with a firm push. The latch clicks into place with reassuring solidity. The hearth glows softly, welcoming you back. You remove gloves and hold your hands toward the warmth, letting circulation return. The scent of smoke blends with the faint, clean aroma of snow carried on your coat. You consider reinforcing the barn door further, perhaps adding a thicker beam across its interior. The task becomes part of your midday plan. A curious detail preserved in certain northern tales recounts that some families hung small bells near barn doors during winter nights to alert them to movement. Whether truly effective or simply comforting, the soft chime carried reassurance. You glance at your own modest supplies and wonder if a similar precaution might be fashioned. Researchers continue to explore how winter predator patterns influence settlement layouts, noting that clustered cabins offered greater collective security than isolated dwellings. Here, your cabin stands alone in its clearing. The awareness sharpens your senses without overwhelming them. You eat a simple breakfast near the hearth, listening to the cabin settle around you. The tracks outside remain vivid in your mind, an image pressed clearly into thought. Snow reveals what summer conceals. It turns the invisible into visible form. It tells you who passed by when and in what direction. By midday, sunlight brightens the clearing, casting long blue shadows in the depressions left by the animals' steps. The contrast makes them even more striking. You gather a few fallen branches and lay them loosely near the barn entrance, not as a barrier, but as an early warning. A disturbed branch will signal movement. As evening approaches, you glance once more toward the forest edge. The prints have softened slightly under sun edges, rounding gently. Soon they will fade entirely, erased by drifting powder or new snowfall. Inside, you bank the fire carefully and ensure the latch sits firm. Tracks across untouched snow remind you that winter is shared territory. Your cabin stands not as a fortress against the wild, but as one small claim within it. And as darkness gathers once more beyond the clearing, you carry that awareness quietly, neither fearful nor complacent, simply attentive to the world that moves beyond your walls. There are evenings when warmth alone is not enough. The fire burns steadily. The cabin holds its familiar glow. Water rests unfrozen near the hearth. Yet something in the air feels thin, as though the silence has stretched too long without interruption. You shift on your stool and glance toward the door, half expecting a knock that you know will not come. Snow still lies thick across the clearing. The path remains faint and unreliable. Visits are rare in this season. It's well established in many frontier diaries that shared stories formed a crucial thread of winter survival. When travel was limited and labour slowed by snow, conversation became its own kind of sustenance. Words filled space that might otherwise echo with isolation. You clear your throat softly and begin to speak, not because anyone else sits in the room, but because the act itself feels grounding. You recount the day you first arrived at the clearing, the way the log smelled fresh, the way frost traced delicate patterns along the window frame. The cabin seems to listen. Flames shift and crackle in response, though perhaps that is only coincidence. A small but charming custom appears in certain rural accounts, describing how families sometimes held informal story nights during the darkest weeks, inviting neighbours when weather allowed, and rotating who would tell the longest tale. Competition was gentle but spirited. The prize might be nothing more than laughter or an extra ladle of stew. There has been thoughtful debate among cultural historians about whether oral storytelling in isolated communities primarily preserved history or served as the imaginative escape. Some scholars argue that legends often carried practical lessons disguised as entertainment. Others emphasize the role of fantasy in easing hardship. Sitting here, you suspect that both purposes intertwine naturally. You continue speaking softly, describing a hunt from earlier in the season. The crisp sound of snow beneath boots, the stillness before movement, the steady breath held before action. Your voice changes the texture of the room. Silence no longer presses quite so firmly. The air seems warmer, though the fire burns no brighter than before. You pause and listen to the echo of your own words fading into timber. The cabin absorbs them gently. Shared stories to stay warm may sound poetic, but there is truth in it. Laughter quickens the breath. Conversation lifts posture. Memory connects past to present, making winter feel less like an endless stretch and more like a chapter within a larger narrative. You recall a tale passed down from another region about a traveller who followed the wrong star through a snowstorm and ended up in a stranger's cabin welcomed with bread and firelight. Whether true or embellished, the story carries reassurance. Doors can open, hospitality can cut through cold. Researchers continue to explore how communal gatherings during winter shaped social cohesion in frontier settlements. Some suggest that storytelling reinforced shared identity. Others note that in extremely isolated cabins, solitary storytelling to oneself or to children maintained mental resilience. You smile faintly at the idea of narrating your own days aloud as though they are epic adventures. In a way they are. Outside, wind brushes lightly across the clearing, but without menace. Inside, shadows ripple softly along the walls. You stand and stir the coals, adding a modest log to keep the glow steady. Sparks rise briefly, then settle. A quiet memory surfaces of a song heard long ago, its melody simple and repetitive. You hum a few lines under your breath. The sound blends with the fire's gentle hiss. There is something deeply human about filling winter silence with voice. Even if no one answers, the act itself affirms presence. You are here, you're breathing, you are living through frozen weeks with patience and steady hands. The animals in the barn shift faintly, their movements carried through night air. Somewhere in the forest a branch cracks under frost. You settle back onto your stool and let your thoughts drift into another tale. Perhaps one about spring, about thawed streams and soft earth underfoot. The promise of green returns like a distant echo. As the evening deepens, you allow your voice to fade into softer murmurs, then into silence once more. The cabin feels less empty now, as though memory itself has occupied the space beside you. Stories may not raise the temperature, but they warm something just as essential. And as you prepare for sleep, banking the fire carefully and arranging your bedding near its steady glow, you carry those words with you into the night. In a remote log cabin during frozen winters, warmth is measured not only in degrees of heat, but in the sound of a voice carried gently across wooden walls. By this point in winter, you no longer notice the smoke at first. It lives in the fabric of the cabin now. It threads itself through wool blankets, settles into the grain of the table, lingers in your hair even after you step outside into sharp, clean air. Only when you pause deliberately do you register its presence fully. You rise early and stir the coals, and with the first fresh log comes a new ribbon of grey curling toward the ceiling. It meets the darker layer already resting along the beams, adding to it quietly. Household records from 18th and 19th century rural dwellings consistently note that interior soot accumulation was a common feature of cabins and early homes that relied exclusively on open hearths. Chimneys drew most of the smoke upward, but rarely all of it. Over time, ceilings darkened and walls absorbed the residue. You tilt your head back and study the beams overhead. Their once pale wood now carries a deepened tone, almost glossy in places where smoke has layered itself repeatedly. The smell is complex, pine resin from fresh logs, the faint tang of char, damp wool drying nearby, a trace of cooked beans from last evening's meal. Smoke does not overwhelm, it blends. A small and rather practical custom documented in some remote communities involved deliberately encouraging a slight smoke presence in storage areas to deter insects and preserve hanging meats. What feels like inconvenience in one context becomes utility in another. You glance at the strips of meat hanging in the cooler corner, and appreciate how the haze likely serves a quiet purpose. Still, there are moments when the air grows thick. On windless days when drafts slow and the chimney draws less efficiently, smoke lingers lower than you would prefer. Your eyes sting slightly. You open the door for a brief exchange of air, despite the cold allowing a rush of crisp freshness to sweep through. There's been ongoing debate among environmental historians about how constant exposure to indoor smoke affected respiratory health in pre-industrial homes. Some argue that adaptation minimized harm. Others point to evidence of chronic irritation. As you cough lightly and wave a hand through the haze, you suspect that comfort and consequence often coexist. You adjust the damper carefully, testing how the flame responds. Too much restriction and smoke spills outward. Too much openness and heat escapes rapidly. The balance is delicate. The kettle begins to steam gently, adding moisture to the air. The blend of steam and smoke softens the room's edges. Light from the hearth diffuses through it, creating a faint amber glow that feels almost luminous. A lesser-known anecdote from certain rural memoirs recounts that some families use the smoke-stained beams as a kind of an informal calendar, noting how the gradual darkening marked passing years. Children would be lifted up to touch the highest beam measuring growth against the smoke line. You imagine that invisible timeline stretching above your head. You sit near the hearth and mend a glove while watching how smoke trails upward in shifting patterns. It moves unpredictably, curling and thinning depending on subtle currents. Outside, Stopul reflects pale daylight, but inside the atmosphere feels warmer and more enclosed. The scent of smoke becomes part of winter's identity. Scholars continue to examine how sensory memory shapes our understanding of historical domestic life. Smell in particular carries powerful associations, yet is rarely preserved in written records. Here you recognize how deeply smoke defines this season. You stand and brush a hand lightly along a beam. Fine soot coats your fingers. You wipe them on a cloth, leaving faint black streaks. There is a certain comfort in the persistence of it. Smoke marks continuity. It means the fire has burned steadily day after day. It signals meals, cooked water, warm tools, dried. In the afternoon, sunlight pierces through the window, covering at a new angle, catching suspended particles in a visible shaft. Dust and soot dance together in the beam. It feels almost ceremonial. You open the door once more for a moment, letting in a gust of icy air that clears the room briefly. When you close it, the warmth returns quickly, and with it the familiar scent. Smoke is not merely residue. It is evidence of life maintained against cold. As evening descends, you sit back and let the haze settle gently near the ceiling. The cabin glows softly beneath its darkened beams. In a remote log cabin during frozen winters, the smell of smoke becomes inseparable from survival. It clings, it lingers, it irritates Sogsali, yet it reassures. And as you prepare to bank the fire once more, you inhale deeply, recognizing that this layered scent tells the story of every day you have endured within these walls. The knock, when it comes, feels almost unreal. It's unreal. At first you think it is another shift of timber in the cold, a familiar creak travelling along the wall. But then it comes again, not loud, just deliberate. Wood against wood. You rise quickly, heart lifting in a way you did not expect. Visitors in deep winter are rare. You cross the cabin in a few steps and press your palm briefly against the door, feeling the chill that seeps through. When you open it, a rush of cold air spills inside, along with a figure bundled in wool and fur, breath clouding thickly in front of their face. Snow clings to their shoulders. For a moment, neither of you speaks. The simple fact of another human presence feels almost startling. It's widely noted in settlement records that winter visits, though infrequent, carried enormous social importance in remote regions. News travelled person to person, often by necessity rather than convenience. A short stop for warmth might carry information from miles away. You step aside and gesture inward. The visitor enters quickly, stamping snow from boots before closing the door firmly behind them. The cabin seems to expand slightly with the added body heat, the added breath. Wool outer layers are removed slowly and hung near the hearth. Steam rises faintly as snow melts from fabric. The scent of cold air and pine accompanies them inside, briefly overpowering the smoke that usually dominates. You pour a cup of warm water and offer it without ceremony. The gesture feels ancient and instinctive. A lesser-known custom recorded in certain frontier communities involved marking winter visits by sharing a small portion of preserved fruit or a sweet saved for special occasions. The act signaled hospitality despite scarcity. You reach for a tiny jar of dried apple slices and set a few on the table, aware of their value. Conversation begins cautiously, then gathers pace. News of a distant cabin whose roof partially collapsed under snow. Word of a trader expected once the next clear stretch of weather arrives. A report of wolf tracks seen closer to another homestead. There has been sustained scholarly interest in how information networks functioned in sparsely settled regions before formal postal systems became reliable. Many historians argue that informal winter visits were critical in maintaining cohesion across distance. Listening now, you understand how each detail matters. You speak in turn, describing the recent storm and the drift against your door. You mention reinforcing your axe handle stretching food stores carefully. The exchange feels balanced, reciprocal. The fire burns brighter, fed by an extra log to accommodate two. Shadows shift across the walls, larger now layered with movement. For a short while the cabin hums differently. Laughter slips out more easily. Silence feels less heavy between sentences. The presence of another person reshapes the room's atmosphere. The visitor mentions a small gathering planned once roads clear, perhaps a shared meal among 3 nearby cabins. The idea feels almost extravagant. Researchers continue to examine how winter gatherings strengthen trust and mutual aid in isolated communities. Evidence suggests that shared hardship often fostered cooperation rather than competition. Sitting here watching steam rise from drying coats, you sense that dynamic unfolding naturally. Time passes quickly in conversation. Outside, the sky dims toward late afternoon. Snow reflects faint golden light through the window covering. Eventually, preparation for departure begins. Layers are pulled back on. Boots laced tightly, the door unlatched with care. Before stepping out, the visitor pauses and presses your hand firmly. The gesture carries more weight than words. Cold air rushes in once more as the door opens. Snow crunches under departing steps. Within moments, the clearing swallows the figure, reducing them to a small moving shape against white before the trees absorb them entirely. You stand at the threshold for a moment longer, listening to the diminishing sound of boots. Then you close the door gently. Inside, the cabin feels changed. The air still holds a trace of fresh cold and pine. The dried apple slices on the table are fewer, the fire burns steadily. The visit was brief, no grand event, no dramatic revelation, yet its impact lingers. Winter community is fragile but profound. Even a short exchange restores perspective, reminding you that your cabin is one point in a wider constellation. As evening settles, again you sit near the hearth and replay the conversation quietly in your mind. News travels onward. Roads may be buried, but connection persists. In a remote log cabin during frozen months, the arrival of a neighbour is more than social call. It is affirmation, and as the firelight flickers across smoke-darkened beams, you feel the warmth of shared presence lingering long after footsteps fade into snow. By now you measure your days less by sunrise and more by the woodpile. It stands just beyond the cabin wall, a quiet stack of stored effort. Each log represents an afternoon spent cutting, splitting, hauling. Each missing space marks warmth already claimed. You step outside in the pale morning light and study it carefully. Snow has settled along the top layer, softening edges. You brush it away with your gloved hand and count roughly in your head. Not in precise numbers, but in impressions. Enough for another week if careful. Enough for 2 if weather remains steady. Historians of early rural households often note that wood consumption during severe winters could reach staggering amounts, sometimes several cords in a single season depending on cabin size and climate. Without modern insulation, heat escaped constantly through walls, roof and floor. You feel that quiet leak every time you stand near the door. Inside, you add a modest log to the hearth and watch it catch slowly. You no longer feed the fire impulsively. You place each piece with intent, aware of how the pile outside gradually shrinks. Time measured by wood is a different kind of calendar. There are no marked squares or printed months. There is only the steady reduction of stacked timber and the slow lengthening of daylight that hints at change. A small yet practical custom documented in some northern settlements involved stacking wood in measured rows, each row representing roughly one day's fuel under average conditions. When one row vanished, another day had passed. You consider whether to arrange your remaining pile more deliberately, turning it into a visible ledger of time. There has been scholarly debate about how accurately frontier families could predict seasonal fuel needs. Some argue that experience sharpened estimation over successive winters. Others point to frequent shortfalls that forced midwinter cutting in harsh conditions. Standing here, you realize that prediction and uncertainty coexist. You carry an armful of logs inside, cradling them carefully to avoid scattering bark across the floor. The weight presses against your forearms, solid and reassuring. You stack them near the hearth in descending order of thickness, planning their use through the day. Morning tasks follow their usual rhythm: water warmed, simple breakfast prepared, animals tended. Yet beneath it all runs the steady awareness of diminishing wood. The fire burns steadily but not extravagantly. You rake coals to concentrate heat, allowing smaller pieces to sustain flame without wasting larger logs. Outside sunlight reflects sharply off snow, creating an illusion of warmth that does not truly exist. The air remains brittle, though perhaps a degree less severe than weeks prior. You pause at midday and step once more to the woodpile, examining its shape. Snow from the storm has compacted the lower layer slightly. You rearrange a few pieces to allow airflow and prevent dampness. It's commonly recognized in rural building studies that proper stacking was essential to maintain dryness and prevent rot even in winter. Moisture trapped between logs could freeze and split fibers. You adjust with care, treating the pile almost like a living structure. A curious anecdote from certain frontier letters recounts how children were sometimes assigned the task of counting logs aloud as they were burned, turning fuel management into a lesson in arithmetic and responsibility. You find yourself silently tallying each piece as you feed it into the hearth. Inside the cabin remains warm enough. Smoke rises steadily, marking another day consumed. Time here does not rush, it diminishes. Each evening you glance at the remaining stack and feel a subtle shift in your chest. Researchers continue to explore how a reliance on tangible resources shapes psychological perceptions of time in pre-industrial settings. Without clocks dominating daily awareness, cycles of fuel, food and daylight form the primary framework. Watching your woodpile shrink, you understand that winter is not counted in hours but in logs. As afternoon fades, you select a slightly thicker piece for the evening burn, allowing it to glow longer into the night. The wood hisses softly as sap pockets warm. The scent of resin mingles with smoke. You sit back and observe the flames, aware that this single log represents both past labour and present comfort. Beyond the walls, the forest holds countless trees, yet each requires effort to transform into usable heat. The pile outside is finite, your strength is finite. Winter is long but not endless. You bank the fire carefully before sleep, placing 2 moderate logs at an angle, so they catch slowly through the night. When you lie down near the hearth, you picture the woodpile in your mind, its shape, its remaining height, the rhythm of its gradual decline. Time measured by woodpiles feels honest. There is no illusion in it, and as the fire settles into a steady red glow, you accept that tomorrow will bring another. Careful choice. Another log lifted. Another day marked not by a page turned, but by timber turned to ash. Winter is not only endurance. Sometimes it surprises you with small pockets of joy. You wake to a morning that feels almost ordinary. The fire has held through the night. The water bucket is unfrozen. The wind rests somewhere beyond the trees without pressing against your walls. There is no festival marked on a calendar here, no printed reminder of celebration. Yet you realize quietly that today marks a small personal milestone. Perhaps the anniversary of your arrival at this clearing. Perhaps the passing of another year of life. Dates blur in long winters, but meaning does not. In many early rural households, simple observances persisted even in harsh seasons. Historical accounts frequently mention modest birthday acknowledgements or midwinter treats crafted from whatever ingredients remained available. Grand feasts were rare, but gestures carried significance. You search your storage carefully and retrieve a small handful of dried berries saved for special use. They are slightly wrinkled now, but still vibrant in colour. You set them aside near the hearth. A lesser-known yet charming detail from some frontier communities describes how families sometimes sweetened winter days by adding a spoonful of molasses to otherwise plain porridge, transforming it into a festive dish. You have no molasses left, but the berries will serve. There has been thoughtful discussion among social historians about whether such modest celebrations meaningfully improved morale in isolated settlements. Some scholars argue that ritual, however small, provided psychological renewal. Others suggest survival concerns overshadowed ceremony. As you warm your porridge and stir in the berries, you sense that even a simple gesture shifts the atmosphere. The bright red fruit against pale oats feels almost extravagant. You sit near the fire and take the first spoonful slowly. Sweetness blooms briefly on your tongue, cutting through the familiar plainness of winter fare. You allow yourself to smile. Outside, snow sparkles under faint sunlight. The clearing remains silent, yet it feels less severe today. You decide to carve a small token from a scrap of wood, something to mark the day. The knife sharpened earlier in the season glides carefully along the grain. Shavings fall in delicate curls to the floor. In certain northern settlements, it was customary to carve simple decorative items during winter downtime, often exchanged as tokens of affection or kept as mementos of endurance. These objects were rarely ornate, but they carried stories. You shape yours into a small smooth disc and etch a simple symbol into its surface. Researchers continue to explore how ritual and creativity intertwined during prolonged periods of isolation. Evidence suggests that even modest acts of self-expression contributed to emotional resilience. Sitting here watching wood transform beneath your hands, you feel the truth of that insight. The cabin glows warmly as afternoon light shifts toward gold. You add a slightly thicker log than usual to the hearth, allowing it to burn brighter for a while. You take time to tidy the space carefully, sweep the floor, rearrange stacked kindling, fold blankets neatly. The cabin feels almost laboratory in its order. There is no audience for this small occasion. No guests arriving with gifts. Yet the act of acknowledging the day feels meaningful. A curious anecdote from one rural memoir recounts how a family once marked a winter birthday by allowing children to stay up slightly later than usual, telling extra stories near the fire. The extension of wakefulness itself became the gift. You consider staying awake longer tonight simply to watch the flames dance. As evening descends, you light a candle in addition to the hearth, though you usually conserve them strictly. The added glow softens corners of the room and makes the cabin feel fuller. You hold the carved token in your palm and trace its etched lines.